Hello and welcome. I am Chilling Tales. As you get ready for bed, you must know that you are doing amazing and you deserve all the sleep you can get. So as you are winding down, let me know where you are from and what time you are watching this video. Like and subscribe to help the channel if you'd like. Now put your mind at ease and let the story unfold. The crackling of twigs beneath my boots was the only sound breaking the hush of the forest. It was that hour when the light hadn't quite given up, but every color felt drained, as if the world was holding its breath. I'd always loved solo camping, the ritual of it, the honesty, something about the rhythm of walking, finding a spot, unpacking, pitching a tent, boiling water. It stripped life down to the simplest pieces: effort, reward, silence. But that evening the trees were different. They leaned in, their dark fingers tangled overhead, and what little sky remained seemed far away, the way a ceiling feels when you're feverish. I told myself I was being dramatic. Too many nights working late, too many city horns and sirens still rattling in my skull. I paused and let my backpack settle against my spine. One more mile, maybe two, and I'd find a clearing, a small fire, tea, silence that didn't feel like it was listening. I shifted my shoulders and pressed on. The trail curved and seemed to darken ahead. It wasn't just nightfall, it was as if the shadows were arriving faster than they should. I caught myself glancing behind more often than necessary. The path back was already a sketch, a smudge of fading color between trunks. That was when a voice spoke, casual as if we'd been walking together for hours. Beautiful evening for a hike, isn't it? I froze. My boots crunched the dirt with a final loud complaint. I hadn't heard him approach, and that fact alone was wrong. A man stood half a dozen paces off the trail, tall and lean, the kind of lean that comes from using your body more than feeding it. His coat was canvas, sun-faded and neatly patched. His face was weathered in the way of people who stand in real weather for real reasons. Everything about him felt ordinary, except his eyes. They were bright, sharp, and endlessly curious, as if I was a puzzle with only one piece missing. "Yeah," I said, steadying my breath, just trying to find a spot before dark. "You're in luck," he said, with the kind of cheer that felt rehearsed. "There's a perfect clearing just up ahead. You won't find a better one before night takes the trail. Come on, it's not far." Every instinct I had put its hands on my shoulders and leaned backward. I almost said I preferred to camp alone, that I had a map, that I was fine. But sunset was stealing the path one shadow at a time, and I was tired. I nodded and fell into step beside him. His stride was easy, practiced. The soles of his boots made almost no noise. He knew the woods. He pointed to a thistle under an alder leaf and called it by a name I didn't know. He tapped a cluster of stones and said there had been a stream here once, years ago, before a storm rearranged the hillside. He knew where birds nested and what the wind meant when it ran cold. His knowledge should have comforted me. It almost did, but each fact dropped like a stone into water, leaving ripples that never quite reached the shore. "What brings you out here alone?" he asked, glancing back with that mild, affable smile. "City gets loud?" "Sometimes," I said. "Needed the quiet." He nodded thoughtfully. "Quiet is honest out here. The woods have a way of keeping you." The way he said keeping made the hair on my arms rise, as if the word had a second meaning he was tasting. We stepped into the clearing as the last light failed. It was, as promised, perfect, flat ground, a ring of stones darkened by old ash, a fallen log at the edge for sitting. I let my pack slip to the dirt and rolled my shoulders. "This is great," I said. "Thanks." "Oh, it's my pleasure." He didn't leave. "Let me help you set up. It'll be dark soon. 4 hands beat 2. "That's okay," I said, suddenly aware of how alone we were. "I've got a system." "Nonsense," He crouched and started pulling out tent poles as if they were his. Wouldn't want you fumbling around in the dark. I hesitated. It felt ruder to argue than to let him help, so I didn't. We worked in a rhythm that was almost comfortable, except for the way his eyes kept flicking to the tree line, as if he expected the forest to answer a question neither of us had asked. He would ask me something quick and personal. Do you live alone? Do you have family who know where you are? And then before I could reply, he would change the subject. Plants, weather, rivers, as if the questions weren't his, but the interruptions were. The tent rose. The sky fell. We finished by moonlight. The clearing, spare and tidy, began to feel like a stage with no audience. I stood and stretched. Well, I said, making it a dismissal, I appreciate the help. I'll be fine from here. He stepped closer, not touching, but close enough to feel present in the air. You've done well, he said, voice lowered, but there's still so much to do before the night is through. My chest tightened. You should probably get back, I said gently, before it gets too dark to find your own camp. He tilted his head, and that small, harmless smile bent the wrong way. Oh, I am exactly where I need to be. You see, these woods, they get hungry, and it's been so long since we've had a visitor. The words landed heavy, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I'd heard them right. I gave a short, nervous laugh, trying to push away the meaning, but his eyes didn't let me. They gleamed in the half-light, fixed and patient. I took a step back, heart thumping. Somewhere an owl made a single sound, and then thought better of it. I considered the tent. My phone was inside, along with the illusion of safety, and he saw me consider it. He shifted his stance just enough to place his body between me and the zippered flap. Let's not be rash, he said, hands raised in a friendly gesture that only made my pulse quicken. The night is young. We have so much to discuss. I don't want trouble, I said. We can go our separate ways. But trouble already found you, he said softly. It was waiting the moment you stepped off the road and onto the old path. Did you not feel it? The way the branches leaned in to listen? The way the quiet thickened in your throat? You've been on the wrong trail since you chose it. I glanced at the trees. The shadows between them looked thicker, less like absence of light, and more like presence of something else. The ground beneath my boots felt less solid than it should have, as though the soil was loosening its memory of being earth. I'm leaving, I said firmly. My voice didn't sound like mine. Now, he smiled as though I'd just confirmed a suspicion. Leave then. The forest always takes back what strays. You'll be walking in circles before the moon is overhead. He didn't move as I shifted sideways, skirting toward the far edge of the clearing. His eyes followed me, gleaming like a predator too patient to chase. You'll be back, he said, his voice low, almost tender. Everyone comes back, because out here, silence is not empty. It's a mouth, and it always opens. I didn't answer. My legs carried me out of the circle of stones, past the log, into the grip of the trees. The dark swallowed me, and every step sounded too loud, too fragile. I told myself to keep walking, to trust the trail, but I couldn't shake the sense that I had stepped off the map, off the world itself, and into a place where directions didn't matter. Behind me, the man's voice rose once, not in anger, not even in warning, but in something that felt almost like prayer. I didn't catch the words. I didn't want to. The woods leaned closer, and I kept moving forward, though forward had begun to feel like a word that meant nothing at all. I didn't look back. Looking back felt like an agreement, and I had a feeling that agreements mattered here more than they should. Branches combed my jacket, as if searching for reasons. The last gray light unraveled between trunks and vanished. What remained wasn't quite darkness, more like a depth that kept multiplying. I told myself there would be a trail marker, a plastic blaze fixed to bark, a familiar switchback. Instead, there were only long, repeating corridors of trees, and the sound of my boots trying to invent a path that wasn't there. The forest had a smell that lived under other smells, loam and cold stone, and something faintly metallic, as if it had swallowed rain and kept the taste of it. I aimed for what felt like downhill, thinking of water, telling myself that streams lead to roads, and roads lead to people. The ground obliged for a while. My headlamp made a tunnel where bugs wavered like ash. Twice I stopped to listen, and twice the quiet leaned in until I could hear my own blood counting. Behind me, nothing. No follow. No snap of foot over twig. I almost wanted him to make noise so I could locate him, fold him up into a sound, and keep it in front of me where I could watch it. The way he had appeared without approach felt like a trick performed with the entire woods as assistant. The beam landed on a fallen birch, its peeled bark like old paper. I climbed, the slickness surprising me, and on the other side, my heel slid on damp leaf mold. I flung a hand to catch myself and touched something that felt woven, a web strung between saplings, strong as twine. It clung to my wrist, and I was a child again, half crying with disgust. Only this time the recoil didn't come. Some small calculus inside me decided that tearing free might say the wrong thing to whatever listened. I held my arm still and let the web settle back on itself. When my skin was clean again, I moved. Time behaved like a dog pretending it didn't understand its name. The tunnel of light swung, dipped and rose. I passed a stump I didn't remember passing before, and then passed it again, catching the same ruffle of bracket fungus, like layered ears. On the third pass, I stopped and pressed my palm against it. The wood was colder than the air around it. I left a glove print on the moss. On the fourth pass, the print was gone. That felt like a warning, or a mercy. I took out my phone. The black glass reflected my face with a miner's pallor. One bar of service flickered, then none. The clock set a time that made no sense, then corrected itself, then remembered a different hour entirely. I set the phone to airplane mode so it would stop lying to me and slide punched the flashlight up to full. The beam brightened as if it were evening again. I laughed then too bright a sound, stupid and human, and immediately wished the sound back. Careful, someone said pleasantly, and I nearly dropped the phone. The voice came from the left, then from the right, then from nowhere, as if my name had been said in a room, and it had been the wrong room. He was not close. He was as close as a rule. You'll disturb the neighbors. I aimed the light into the spaces between trunks. The white stamens of late flowers glowed, and then looked like teeth when I blinked. I'm leaving, I said, because saying it might be part of leaving. I don't need your clearing. Of course you don't, he said. Not now. Not ever, I said. But even to me the words sounded like a rope that might break. He didn't answer that. Silence filled and hardened like resin. I went on. The path when I found it was not a path so much as the memory of one. It curved in a way that asked to be followed. I followed. The ground dipped, bowed, and then tightened under my steps, as if the earth was clenching a fist around my ankles. I shook the feeling off and told myself story after story about how dawn always comes, about how complicated places look simple in the morning, about creek beds and ridge lines and trail designers who favored the contour line over the straight climb. You could put faith in the way people build. It's the way things made themselves that you had to watch. A glow appeared through the trees, low and steady and warm. The reflexive relief in my chest broke like a thrown glass. Camp, fire, people. I stumbled toward it, careless for the first time since I'd left the clearing, branches nipping at me like reprimands. A small circle opened. My boots scuffed rock. The glow showed itself, a ring of stones, darkened by old ash, and a fallen log at the edge for sitting. I stood there and tried to swallow the taste in my mouth. The tent was there, my tent zippered quietly. the headlamp's ghostly cone still faint inside where I'd left it hanging. My pack was where I'd set it. A dent in the dirt showed where I'd knelt to drive a stake. The only new thing was a neat little pyramid of sticks built over the dead coals, a promise of fire waiting for a match. Circle walking saves time, he said from somewhere just outside the circle of glow. You'd be amazed how much distance you can cover, not getting anywhere. I took 2 steps backward. The beam of my phone flashlight swept the trunks, making them look like pillars in a ruined temple. You followed me? I didn't need to, he said. You came back. I tried to imagine sleeping in the tent with him anywhere in this forest. I tried to imagine running until dawn peeled the night off the branches, not falling, not misstepping, never needing to close my eyes. Neither picture stayed steady. They blurred and bled at the edges and became the same picture of a person tripping on their own choices. Why me? I said, the words out before I could trap them. He liked questions. He liked what answers cost. I tasted the mistake, a pause almost tender. We ask that at first, don't we? He said. Then the path opened. You stepped on it. That's not an answer. It's the only one you can afford. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ticked. I didn't like that comment because it made a ledger out of me. I'm done talking, I said, to him or to myself. I went to the tent, as if boldness could be a disguise. He didn't move to block me. I unzipped, slid inside as if the thin layer of fabric could be a world, and grabbed the first 2 things my hands touched, a metal water bottle that felt like a certainty, and the heaviest length of broken branch I had kept for firewood. By the time I backed out, he was standing where I had been, hands in his pockets, as if this were a bus stop and we were waiting for the same bus. You're thirsty, he observed. Everyone is. The body keeps count, even when the mind can't. Keep your distance, I said. He kept it, until he didn't. He moved a fraction to the side, and the fraction was enough to draw him into the beam and turn his pupils into bright coins. We can do this the hard way, he added, as if offering a perk. Hard for who? I said. He didn't answer. Some people don't need to. I threw the water down the back of my throat in big, graceless swallows, not because it was wise, but because it felt like a refusal, and every refusal felt like a plank under my feet. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand and didn't put the bottle down. The branch's weight told me what it wanted me to do. I told myself I wouldn't. I told myself not to make this into a story where the solution is hitting something, because those stories never tell you what happens after you swing. Do you live alone? He asked, as if he were making conversation at a laundromat. Is anyone waiting to hear from you tonight? I didn't answer. He nodded, satisfied with my silence, and the nod itself felt like he had eaten something I'd meant to hide. What is it you do in the city? He asked, quick, almost bright. What keeps your hands busy? The questions were close to the body, near the bones that make you a person. I concentrated on my breathing until it sounded like the ocean in a shell. He smiled, approving. You're good at quiet, he said, and somehow it didn't feel like praise. I moved then, not away from him, but along an arc that kept us the same distance, but shifted the line between. He mirrored me neatly, the way 2 dancers find the same step. When his shoulder turned, small and careless as if offering the night a better look, I saw what I needed to see, a soft spot under the lean. He was strong because he knew how to be, not because he had to be. That made him vulnerable to interruption. I didn't plan it. Planning would have made it wrong. I let the branch swing. The sound surprised me. Wood on bone, a dry, hollow knock like a door, asking if it could come in. He reeled back, not with a cry, but with an expression like someone watching a table tip in slow motion. His hand went to the struck place and came away clean. That was unkind, he said mildly, as if I'd skipped my turn in a game. It was enough. I ran. This time I didn't aim for downhill. This time I aimed for where the trees were younger and closer together, the places where the woods didn't want to be walked. Branches whipped my face, scratched lines into my cheek that stung when sweat found them. The beam bounced and joggled. A root lifted under my toe, and I fell into the kind of fall you don't stop, the kind that announces itself with a brief, weightless question. I hit on a hip and a shoulder. Breath popped out of me. I lay there waiting for pain to come in a clean line, but it came in many small ones. His voice followed at the right speed, never hurrying, never breathless. Careful, he called, not unkind. The ground changes its mind. Shut up, I said, into the dirt, into my own mouth. The phone had skittered from my hand. The beam made a drunk arc through leaves and found a cluster of pale mushrooms opening like small ears. I scrabbled for the phone and found instead a stone that fit the palm, warm as if it had been in someone's pocket. I threw it without looking. The sound it made when it hit a trunk felt satisfying beyond reason. I crawled and then got my knees under me and then got my feet under my knees. The phone lay in a nest of damp leaves. Its light found me. I grabbed it and tasted soil and old rain and bark. The forest changed. You can say it like that, like a line item, but the experience is slower and uglier. The trees didn't move exactly. The spaces between them did. Distances inverted. A clump of ferns I thought I could reach in 3 steps receded like something seen through heat. A gap I'd taken for a shortcut closed into knotted roots. I tried to keep my direction on a bearing I could feel in my teeth. The notion of north wilted. The idea of compass felt like a joke you tell yourself to calm your hands. I found a stream that wasn't there. It was not water, no sound, no smell, nothing wet, but reflections moved on it as if the moon had been chopped up and poured there. When I stepped into it, the cold went through my boot like thought, and my ankle lurched in sudden protest. I hissed air and didn't cry out. I stood on the bank that wasn't a bank and bent to touch my laces, to feel my body again, to make a loop and a knot in a world that was beginning to prefer curves and tangles. "Let me help you," he said from somewhere behind, and the sincerity was the worst part. "It's not so bad if you give it a shape. People are good at cages, especially the ones they don't know they're building." I pictured him taking my elbow, guiding me back toward that ready-made pyramid of sticks, lighting it for me, dropping the first coal of night in my lap like a gift. I didn't let the picture breathe. I crossed the false stream and felt nothing wet at my cuff. The cold stayed because cold doesn't need water to move in. The woods were not empty. That matters. I caught a fox once in the beam. Its eyes 2 dropped coins that flared and then banked as it flowed away. A bird took off with the silent suddenness of something remembering it was alive. The small presences helped. They pressed against the huge presence and made little dents in it, enough for me to know where I ended. I moved through those dents. I stepped in a deer's print and felt superstitious about it, as if I could borrow an animal's way of belonging. More than once the woods offered me a shape I would have followed if I were not afraid. A rectangle of darker dark that suggested a cabin, a slant that had the geometry of roof. Twice I smelled smoke where there was no light, and once I heard voices braided together in a conversation so ordinary it made the hair on my arms stand up. The denim scrape of someone shifting on a camp chair, the brief ping of a jar lid. I kept moving, even though the human sounds tugged at me like a mother tugging a child's hand across a street. The tug made me realize how much I wanted to be led. That was helpful. Wanting is a compass. You can aim away from it when you need to. I don't know how long it was before I found the old sign. The post had rotted through and fallen, but the board still clung to it by one surviving nail. The letters were a few scars of white paint, not enough to read, but the shape was right for words. I lifted it. It had a weight that felt like an instruction point. I turned it toward my left and immediately hated that the decision felt easy. I put it back down and faced the opposite direction and counted backward from 10 like a patient in a theater with masks and bright lights. When the counting reached nothing, I started walking where my eyes did not want to go. Something in the dark laughed. It wasn't him, it was the small relieved laugh of a trick denied its performance. My ankle barked complaint every 20th step. I gave it a number, and then the numbers made a pattern, and then the pattern turned into pacing. When the pain was due again, I would slow, breathe into it, and then resume. It was crude and stupid, and kept me from thinking too fast, and so it saved me for a while. You do strange arithmetic when the night is trying to put you on a ledger. The slope lifted, the air changed. I paused only because my body paused, a decision I arrived at the way you arrive at a platform, because your train stops under your feet. There was a ridge here, low, hardly worth the name, but single-minded. I stepped along it, and the ground quit being tricky for a few minutes, as if the forest were bored and wanted me to leave so it could get back to itself. He came when I had begun to think he had decided to let me go. He stepped out at the edge of the beam with such ordinary timing that I wondered if I had invented the whole absence, just so he could return better. He did not look winded. There was a smudge on his coat where the branch had met bone. His smile looked tired now, but people who practice like to show you that they can fatigue and still perform. His eyes, though, those were bright, bright as if distance didn't dull their appetite. "You're doing well," he said. "You're learning the shape of it." "What happens if I keep going until morning?" I asked before remembering I wasn't answering questions. The rule didn't exist yet, still some part of me had begun to keep it. "You'll be very tired," he said, "and the day will look the way it always looks, and you'll convince yourself you made a fuss." "That's all right," he added, and for a breath he sounded like someone's big brother. "Some people need to make it small to carry it." "And you?" I said, damned by my own need to push. "What do you need?" He considered this, an actor pretending to break character. "I need the night to be long enough," he said. "I need what comes into it to have manners." "Manners," I repeated, because the word was wrong and therefore helpful. He shrugged. "An old word for the way things are allowed to be with each other. You came in without knocking, but you can still be polite." He gestured to the trees. "There are ways to ask that don't sound like asking." I hated that I wanted him to explain. I hated that he made sense the way a trap makes sense to a leg. "Why pretend?" I said. "Why not just take what you want?" "Because wanting is a worse prison than consent," he said, so easily it had to be a lesson he'd learned a long time ago. "You know this. You've worked late enough nights to understand how wanting keeps you in a chair long after your body left." Something in my face told him he'd chosen well. He stepped closer. A twig cracked under his boot, a tiny mercy. "Say yes to one thing," he suggested. "A small yes. We can count it as a visit. We can call the rest a misunderstanding. You'll walk out with a story you don't believe. You'll sleep, finally. You'll boil water for tea." His eyes flicked to the hand that held my bottle. "You can keep the thought that you won." The urge to agree passed through me so cleanly I almost heard it. I could say yes to something I didn't understand. I could give a small piece of something with a name I didn't value and be done. That's what he was offering, because he wasn't a person. He was a hinge. You move through him or you don't. "No," I said, and the word didn't feel brave. It felt expensive. He didn't sigh. He didn't pout. He gave me a look of courteous disappointment. The look a teacher gives a student who refuses a shortcut that would have saved them half a year. "Then keep going," he said. "It makes no difference. The night is larger than you are." "I know," I said. That part was easy to agree with. I went past him and did not turn my head to see if he watched me, but of course he did. It's what watching is for. The ridge dropped me into a shallow bowl where the trees grew thickly and at wrong angles, like bones mended without a doctor. I had to slide sideways, my pack catching. A branch hooked the strap, and held on as if remembering an old grudge. I unbuckled, shrugged, and freed myself with the bitter satisfaction of escaping a shirt that didn't fit. I left the pack hanging. It felt like losing my name. I made myself keep walking without it. The bowl had collected colder air. Mist lay close to the ground, and when my beam slid over it, the brightness dulled as if the light had been wrapped in cloth. The trunks ahead chewed the beam and returned it in narrow, unhelpful bites. I tripped on something that sounded like bone, but was only a dry stick, and the part of my mind that names things quickly began to put skulls under leaves and rib cages in grasses. I breathed until the pictures stopped arriving quite so quickly. There were no bones. There were bones. Both things were true here, depending on which way you aimed your attention. At the far lip of the bowl, breath nipping, I heard water. Not the false water from before, but a child's version of a stream, eager to explain itself. I followed it and found a real runlet, making its way over stones like somebody's hands testing a piano. The sight of the tiny, honest industry unclenched something in me. I crouched and dipped my fingers. Cold was what it should be. The chill climbed the veins and wrote its initials in the thin skin at my wrist. I cupped and drank and tasted iron, leaf, night. When I stood again, I was tempted to thank it and didn't, because gratitude is also a kind of agreement. Polite, he murmured from a tree's far side, and my heart put both hands against my ribs. But prudent. How long will you keep this up? I asked, reckless with the small strength the water had given me. He walked into view with the unremarkable correctness of a man stepping into a kitchen. Until it's finished, he said. Everything ends, even you. You talk like a priest, I said. I don't know why I wanted to stain him with a human job. He laughed. Priests talk like me, he said, or like the thing behind me, or like the thing behind that. His smile brightened. Keep going. You're almost where you're not supposed to be. That was a trick he hoped I wouldn't step into. The negative map, the invitation disguised as warning. I stepped into it anyway, because the alternative was stepping back, and stepping back had begun to feel like an apology that would harden into stone. The woods thinned without losing density. That's the best I can tell it. The trunks were farther apart, yet they looked closer together. I moved with the careful confidence of a person entering a room where someone is asleep. A pale strip opened, a path or a scar, or the memory of a road. It ran straight between trees that had learned how to stand like pillars. The straightness made me suspicious, and I welcomed that. Suspicion had saved me more times than bravery ever did. I walked the strip. After 20 steps, the air loosened. After 40, my shoulders pulled away from my ears. After 60, I could smell something that didn't belong in the woods. Ash and old paper, and a scent like chalk dust sifted through clean linen. I recognized the smell before I recognized the sight. I had smelled it in old buildings, in rooms where words had been carved into desks and left to accumulate. The clearing was thin as a held breath. I didn't see it so much as arrive inside it, like walking through a doorway with no frame. I knew it was a clearing because my lungs said it was. The trees had taken a step back and were pretending to be indifferent. In the center lay a low, broad stone, flat as a butcher's block, and its surface gleamed with lines the way a river gleams with current. The bark of the surrounding trunks bore shallow cuts, careful and clean, each groove dark like writing turned inside out. Something in me moved toward it, the way a hand moves toward a heat source on a cold morning. I stopped the movement with effort, like catching a glass just before it falls. A twig whispered behind me, the sound so soft it might have been breath. Fingers closed over my mouth. Not his. The hand was steady and warm and smelled like earth and a little like smoke. Don't scream, a voice said in my ear. It was a woman's voice, low and clear, and threaded with a calm that my muscles wanted to borrow. I'm trying to help you. My body stopped choosing panic and chose stillness instead. The hand loosened. I didn't turn. Not yet. The voice came again, closer to my bones this time, as if it had taken up residence in the space between my ribs. Can you walk without telling the leaves you're here? She asked. I nodded. The hand left my mouth, but not my presence. She didn't step into my beam. She stood just beyond where the light would name her. And I turned my head a fraction and caught a plain outline, a braid wound tight against her head, the pale curve of a cheek with a smudge on it like ash, eyes half-lidded but bright. Good, she said. Then do exactly what I do, and don't answer him when he talks to you. He never stops, I whispered, and the whisper seemed to sit politely on the air instead of rushing off to tell secrets. That's why we move now, she said. Before he notices you've learned not to listen. She took my wrist the way you might guide someone who is sleepwalking, neither dragging nor asking, simply keeping two bodies in the same sentence. We slid between the marked trunks, skirting the stone's neat geometry, and the trees allowed us, the way a crowd allows certain people when it wouldn't for others. I felt the man's attention as a pressure in my back, turning, adjusting, looking for a shape. It felt good to leave that pressure behind, like a coat you decide not to take with you into the next room. We moved over ground that didn't creak or complain. Once she stopped and crouched and pressed her palm to the earth as if listening through it. I crouched too, thinking of a hinge loosening, of a door easing in its frame. The air felt like hands unclasping. She nodded to herself, a small movement that meant we would keep living for the next handful of breaths. Who are you? I said, too hungry for an answer to keep the question from falling out of my mouth. Later, she said. He likes names. Don't give him any. She waited until the space itself quieted again, and then rose, and I rose with her. The beam stayed low, licking the ground just ahead of our toes. The forest at the edge of the light looked patient and disinterested, the way predators like to look when they are resting. The woman's breath was slow and regular and unafraid. Mine climbed toward hers and then matched it, as if lungs can be taught like hands. The man's voice followed at a distance that was not measured by feet. Rude, he said, amused, borrowing a guide without a greeting. We didn't answer, and the not answer felt like the first correct step I'd taken all night. What is this place? I asked finally, because even obedience has to ask something, or it breaks. The question floated between us and didn't run away. She tilted her head toward the thinned oval we had just left, where the stone lay with its carved channels catching moonlight. You already know, she said, but you want me to say it so you don't have to hear yourself. She waited, as if considering whether she'd give me the ease. She didn't. Instead, she moved again, and I followed, and the night let us pass with the prickly courtesy reserved for people who have learned the first rule and are waiting to learn the second. She walked like someone who belonged, and I followed the way a shadow follows its object. Her grip on my wrist was steady, never tight, but it kept me tethered in a forest that seemed ready to rearrange the moment I lost focus. I thought of the man's bright eyes, his patient smile, the way he had spoken about the woods with the casual intimacy of someone describing a family secret. The woman's silence felt like the opposite, discipline instead of performance. The forest seemed to respect her silence, which made me respect it too. We moved between trunks so old, they leaned against each other for balance. Once or twice, something darted across the beam of my light, too quick for recognition, fur or feather or something that never had a name. I kept waiting for the man's voice to call out, but it didn't. The absence was not comfort, it was attention, like waiting for a clock to strike. When we finally stopped, it was at a place the woods had pressed into a kind of oval. The ground sloped slightly, as if the earth itself had exhaled and not drawn breath again. The woman released my wrist, and for a moment I felt lighter, then dangerously untethered. She crouched and brushed a patch of dirt clear, revealing more of those carved grooves, clean and deliberate, as if the soil itself respected them and kept them safe. They radiated in arcs and spirals, intersecting like veins of water seen from high above. "This place listens differently," she said, her voice quiet enough that I had to lean to catch it. "What does that mean?" I asked, hating the way my whisper carried more loudly than hers. She studied me for a long moment, her expression a mixture of calculation and recognition. "It means you have a chance." My stomach clenched. A chance at what? Her gaze moved past me to the trees circling the space, and though there was nothing visible there, her focus made me turn too. The forest seemed to lean in, not aggressively, but curiously, the way a child might lean toward a whisper they aren't supposed to hear. "You stepped onto the wrong path," she said, "or the right one, depending on who you ask. There are trails that exist for maps, and there are trails that exist for memory. You found the second." I remembered the man's words. The old path, the branches listening, the silence thickening. My mouth went dry. And him? Who is he? She brushed the dirt from her palms as if washing them clean. "He's what the path makes when it needs a face. The woods don't hunt by themselves. They need someone to walk ahead of the hunger. That's him." The night pressed closer, thickening at the edges of my vision. I hugged my arms around myself and asked the only question left. "And you?" Her eyes found mine, steady and without apology. "I'm what the path makes when it doesn't want everyone to be eaten." The words struck something between hope and despair in me. I wanted to believe her, but I had already learned the danger of wanting too much. Still, she had led me here, and he had not stopped us. That counted for something. The stone loomed into view as we moved again. It was wide, flat, its surface traced with channels that seemed to drink moonlight greedily, holding it like water. Around it, the trunks bore their careful scars, symbols etched deep enough to outlast weather. I felt a pulse under my feet, faint but steady, like standing on the chest of something vast and asleep. I didn't want to step closer, but I did, because the woman did. She circled the stone, always keeping her eyes on it, as if it might move. Her fingers hovered just above the grooves, tracing their patterns without touching. "This is where the rules live," she said. "Rules?" I asked. "Everything old has rules," she said simply. "You're alive because you haven't broken them yet, but the night doesn't last forever. He'll push harder now. He'll want your agreement." I thought of his questions, where I lived, who was waiting for me, what I carried into the woods. Each one had felt harmless in the moment, like ordinary curiosity. Each one had been a trap waiting for my answer. "He wants me to say yes to something," I said slowly. She nodded. "And if you do, you'll never leave." A rustle passed through the clearing, though no wind stirred. It sounded like laughter muffled in leaves. My skin crawled. "So what do I do?" She tilted her head, considering me with the same patience she had given the earth earlier. "You need a rule of your own, something you choose, not something he gives you. That's how you survive the night." I stared at her, uncomprehending. "How do I make a rule?" She smiled faintly, not kindly, but knowingly. "The same way you make fire. You gather what you have, strike it against itself, and see if it catches." Before I could respond, a voice slid through the trees like oil. "You found a teacher," the man said. He stepped into the clearing as easily as if he had always been there. His coat looked older now, the patches darker, and his face carried a brightness that made my stomach knot. He glanced at the woman, then at me, his smile sharpened by amusement. "The woods are generous." The woman straightened, her body angled slightly in front of mine. "Generous doesn't mean endless," she said. The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You always make it sound like a sermon. Why waste the night on riddles when a simple yes would do?" He looked at me again, his eyes alight. "You want quiet? We can give you that. Not the kind the city pretends to have, but the deep kind, the honest kind, the kind that keeps you. All you have to do is agree. His words slid into me like water into cracks. For a moment, I imagined it. No deadlines, no sirens, no restless neighbors. Just quiet forever. My heart wanted it, even as my mind screamed against it. The woman's voice cut through, sharp and steady. She already knows the cost. The man sighed, almost wistful. Cost, bargain, rules. You speak like the forest is a miser. It only wants balance. Balance, the woman said flatly, is just hunger dressed as fairness. They stared at each other, and I had the sudden chilling realization that this was not the first time they had stood like this, not the first time they had argued over someone caught between them. The forest had seen this play before. The man broke the silence first, his smile returning with renewed patience. "It doesn't matter," he said softly. "The night is long, and she will answer before it ends. They always do." He stepped back into the shadows, his presence lingering even after his body was gone. The clearing seemed to sigh in relief, but it was the kind of relief that comes when a predator leaves the room, but not the territory. I swallowed hard. What if I can't think of a rule? The woman's gaze softened slightly. "You will. The forest will press you until you do. That's how it works." Her words should have terrified me, but instead they steadied me. The forest was old, relentless, patient, but it had rules. And rules, once learned, could be survived. We stayed in the clearing, the stone glowing faintly under the moon, the air thick with the weight of what had passed and what was still coming. I thought about all the small rituals of camping I loved, the way a tent became a house, the rhythm of boiling water, the order of unpacking, rules I had given myself, repeated until they meant something. Maybe that was where I'd find it, something simple, something mine. But as the night deepened and the woods leaned closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was already listening, waiting for me to decide how I would let it keep me. Pravitane provoclanduris. I didn't know if the carvings made the clearing safer or simply honest. The woman circled the stone once, not touching it, and in the stillness, I noticed the faintest breath of scent, like rain that had already fallen somewhere else. She nodded to a space between two marked trunks, and I stepped there, feeling foolishly as if I'd just obeyed the first rule of a game I hadn't agreed to play. The stone's lines weren't random. They were shallow channels, intersecting and curling, like a river traced 100 different times, and here and there a notch had been carved deep enough to hold a small pool of moonlight. The woman pressed a finger to her lips, and then to the ground beside the stone. I mimicked her crouch. The forest breathed. My own breath finally slowed enough to hear hers, and I realized she was not afraid in the way I was. Her stillness wasn't rigid, it was patient. She leaned close so her whisper could live and die between us. "You didn't take the tourist trail," she said. "You took the old one. It opens after certain storms and closes when it's had enough." I thought of the weathered man, of the way his questions darted and hid, of how he'd known precisely where the wind meant something. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice cracking on the shape of the question. "He," she said, eyes lifting to scan the darkness between the nearest trunks, "is the trail's memory. There's always one. They learn the paths, feed the hunger, keep the balances. They don't start that way. They're made." A dry tick like a tongue on bark sounded somewhere beyond the ring of marked trees. Her hand tightened around my wrist once, a small anchor. "They smell fear," she said, "but they prefer consent." The words slid over my skin like cold water. "Consent," I whispered. "To be kept," she said, and then, with a small shake of the head, "or to keep." The notches on the stone caught the moon's pale attention, and the lines resolved into a shape I couldn't name, something between a map and a face. "I don't want either," I said too loudly. The leaves turned the sound over and over until it was quiet again. The woman watched me with an expression that wasn't pity. "Then you'll need a rule," she said, "one that belongs to you." She touched one of the carved grooves and then pinched her fingers together carefully, as if gathering something invisible. When she opened them again, nothing had changed that I could see, and yet I felt the space around the stone take a breath. "I'll hold the circle," she said. "You decide." My mouth had gone dry. I tried to decide what deciding meant. The notches, the lines, the symbols in the bark. Someone had cut them with a purpose that didn't end at the edge of the clearing. "What is this place?" I whispered again, because maybe a second asking would buy me a second answer. "A table," she said softly, "for bargains that don't look like bargains." The wind didn't move, but something like it passed through the clearing. A rustle, a thinning. The hair on my neck lifted. The woman's head tilted. "He's close," she breathed. "Stay inside the marks. If you step out, the forest is the only listener." My legs wanted to run. My chest wanted to shout. But I stayed where the bark bore its careful cuts, where the soil felt oddly firm, and I tried to swallow the idea that this stone was a gate instead of a monument. The woman leaned against a tree and let her eyes close for the length of a slow inhale. "When he speaks," she said, "do not answer his questions. He has enough answers already." A shadow thinned between two trunks. The man stepped into the clearing as if it had been waiting for him, the way a chair waits for the person who always sits in it. He was smiling, of course, not wide, not unkind, just attentive. His eyes moved first to the woman and then to me, and the brightness there made me think of a knife well cared for. "You found a guide," he said mildly. "The woods are generous." The woman's gaze didn't move. "You've been generous too long," she said. "Let the night breathe without you." He clicked his tongue once, considering. "That's not how breath works," he said. "In and out, one and the other. Visitors and keepers." She chose the path. "The path chose itself," the woman said. "You know the difference?" The man looked around the stone circle as if appreciating a set table. "It's late to argue doctrine," he said, "and I don't have a quarrel. I came to offer comfort. The forest is always easier on the ones who accept its terms." His eyes settled on me again, bright and patient. "You were tired," he said, voice warm. "You needed quiet. We can give you that. A deep, holding quiet, the kind you carry back with you. Or," he added, with a softness that felt like a hand against the back of my neck, "the kind that holds you here." The woman's shoulders lifted in a breath I could almost hear. She stepped once, only once, and the space between us felt different, thicker. "She knows the cost," she said. She asked what this place is. She understood to ask. The man's smile quivered, as if he'd felt a thin thread snap somewhere he'd thought secure. He kept his voice level. "You wandered," he said to me. "You trespassed on old hospitality. The forest cleans its wound by making it a mouth, but there are exceptions for those who listen." He placed his palm on the marked bark of a nearby tree. The symbols there darkened, not in color but in presence, as if they'd been sleeping and now woke. "Listen," he whispered. The ground hummed. It felt like remembering a song without recalling the words. I didn't want to listen. I wanted a rule, something small enough to fit between my hands. I thought of the camping rituals I loved, the clean lines, the order, the way a tent becomes a simple, honest house. I thought of a kettle, of water just before it boils, shivering with restrained motion. "What rule?" I asked the woman, barely moving my mouth. "One you'll obey," she said. "For a night, for a year, for a cost you can live with." I looked at the man's hand on the bark, at his coat, at the patches that were embroidered, not with thread, but with something that caught the moon like scales. I thought of the branch in my hands, the dry knock when it struck him, the expression he'd worn, not pain but surprise. He could be interrupted, he could be made to wait. Waiting, I realized, might be the only thing the forest didn't like. "I'll keep time," I said, and the words came out before I knew what they were. The woman's eyes opened. "Say it," she said. The man's head tilted. "Careful," he murmured. Words fit like rings. My mouth opened, and the rule gathered itself, the way you let a loop of rope fall into order on the ground. "I will keep time," I said. "I will count the night by the small sounds it makes. If I keep true count until dawn, I leave with all I brought. If I lose count, the forest can keep something I forget to name." The silence after was not empty. The woman closed her eyes again, and when she opened them, they were damp. "It's clean," she said. The man's smile didn't fade, but the brightness of his eyes did. "Counting," he said dryly, as if I'd chosen a poor dessert. "Numbers and bones. They have different tastes." He took his hand off the tree and flexed it once, as though it had fallen asleep. "Very well." He spread his fingers, and the circle of bark-marked trunks seemed to lean very slightly away from him, as if the stone preferred what I had said. "Begin," he said. The first sound was my own breath, measured on purpose, not in panic. 1. The woman lifted her hand and turned it as if cradling a delicate moth. A leaf let go high above us and spun to the ground in 3 small catches of air. 2, 3, 4. Far away, something moved like a deer that had remembered it was only a story told to calm a child. 5. Counting without counting minutes or hours was a strange prayer. You become porous, letting the night in on its own terms, only deciding that each entry deserves a number. The man moved around the edge of the circle like a shadow checking windows. He didn't touch the stone. He didn't need to. His presence pressed against it like a tide against a step. He spoke now and then, not to me, but to the space around me. Small remarks about the way moss clung to the shaded side of bark, or how the absence of flies meant the day had been cooler than it felt. None of it asked a question. "The forest likes consent," the woman had said. "It prefers to be invited, even if the invitation is only your answer to a question you didn't hear yourself make." I kept counting. A moth stitched across the cleared oval and vanished into the woman's hair. 6. A root settled underground with a soft wooden sigh that felt impossibly near. 7. A thin high creek like ice insisting to itself. It still remembered how to be a river. 8. The man paced slower. I felt his attention as a change in temperature, a nearness like standing on the line between sun and shade. "You'll miscount," he said mildly. "Everyone does." I didn't answer. A small wind found the clearing at last and lifted the tiny hairs along my forearms as if reading from a page. 9. The woman whispered something too soft to hear and traced the edge of one carved groove with her fingertip. The moon tilted a degree. 10. The hunger in my chest for speech was a physical ache. Language is a kind of heat, and I was cooling. That was, I realized, the forest's hope, that I would want to fill the silence with my own voice, to ask or answer, and in doing so, cede the count to something else. 11. The man laughed once, not unkindly. "Time is a net," he said. "It catches you when you forget you're holding it." Somewhere to my right, a sentence formed inside me. "He's trying to name how long you last." I let it pass through without catching on anything. 12. Minutes, hours, what were those? Next to the small syllables of the night. A beetle clicked near my shoe. 13. The man chose a different tack. He began to hum under his breath. A tune with no beginning and no end. The sort of tune you might tie a knot to if you were binding a bundle you planned to carry forever. I watched the way his throat moved, the small muscle at the jaw. 14. I was losing measure, not to sleep, but to a kind of drifting that pretends to be sleep. So I stood. I didn't step out of the circle. I rose, and the night made a soft approving sound like a page turning. 15. The woman's eyes met mine for a heartbeat, and warmed, then cooled back to watchfulness. The man paused his humming. "You'll tire," he suggested. "You'll count the same cricket twice." I wanted water. I wanted tea. I wanted the ordinary. The wanting itself became a sound. 16. Time didn't move forward or back, but sideways, like a fox avoiding a trap it had chewed its way out of before. 17. The notches on the stone had collected more moon. The lines glistened, and I recognized, for a split second, a coastline I had once seen from a plane window, a shoreline with secret harbors. The recognition itself was a noise, a small click. 18. My lips were dry enough that I licked them, and the tiny wet sound shocked me with its loudness. 19. The man sighed, and there was a thread of impatience braided through it. Some nights, he said, we let it go. A bird for a ring, a tooth for a name. He lifted a hand and closed it, as if remembering how small something had been once. But not tonight, he said. It's been too long. The woman's palm touched the stone, and the clearing exhaled. 20. The man's eyes flicked to the edges between trees, and his voice slipped, for a breath, into a register that didn't belong to human throat. You promised, he murmured, and the leaves answered with a hush that could have been a warning or a prayer. I felt the circle shiver. The forest was listening, but it was also judging the game. 21. I realized then that the rule I'd made had a second edge. If I lost count, the forest could keep something I forgot to name. That meant I could perhaps choose what to forget, if it came to it. The thought made me cold, but it also steadied me. If I broke, I would break my way. 22. Near midnight. If midnight was a place the night allowed you to visit, the man spoke a true question. What did you bring into these woods? The words slid around the circle like a slow eel. The woman's head snapped toward him, and the bark behind him seemed to tighten. The question was small, ordinary, but it carried hooks. An answer would require a list, and a list would become a counting of a different kind. I let the question dissolve against the rule. A branch let go of a clump of wet leaves and dropped them in a soft plop onto the stone's corner. 23. I felt the ache in my calves, the tremble in my hands. I wanted to sit. I wanted to sleep. I wanted to let the count go and wake wherever waking found me. The man's smile widened a fraction. He could smell, once the way some people can smell rain. You can lay down, he said gently. We can count for you. The woman laughed once, a dry sound like a match that refuses to catch. He'll count you, she said, her voice for me alone. He'll count you out. A small animal skittered at the edge of the clearing and stopped, remembering itself into stillness. 24. I let my knees bend but kept my feet beneath me, a compromise my body accepted with something like gratitude. The night's texture changed, coarser, as if the loom had switched threads. 25. When the man moved again, it was a tiny step that placed him where my shadow fell. My shadow shifted as if embarrassed. 26. The woman's fingers made a shape I didn't know, and then folded it into her palm. The man's shoulders eased, but not for me. He was easing toward dawn, as one eases toward a closing door, certain he could keep it open with a hand if he reached in time. What will you let it keep? He asked, casual as commenting on the weather. I breathed in the smell of damp stone, a faint sweetness like crushed fern, the iron hint of earth. 27. Name it, he urged. A small thing, a small price to carry a quiet home with you that will never leave. I felt the suggestion trying to borrow my voice. I kept mine still. Somewhere far off, an owl remembered its job and gave it a try. 28. The woman's shoulders dropped a fraction, as if she'd been holding a breath too long. I knew then the owl had been her doing, or her sign. The man heard it and frowned. Antique tricks, he said, with mild contempt that was more wounded than angry. They still work, she said, because the forest loves old things best. The man's teeth showed. It loves what it is given, he said, and it prefers not to be made to wait. A tree shuddered, the kind of movement you feel in your feet more than see. 29. The man stepped very close to the edge of the circle, and the symbols cut into the nearest trunk seemed to brighten against their bark. "Are you sure," he said to me softly, "a last persuasion, that you counted the leaf and not the sound your mind invented for it?" The doubt arrived like a seed with its own weather. I felt it open. My count faltered. The woman's eyes snapped to mine. She shook her head once, barely, and placed her palm flat on the stone, pressing. The clearing answered with a hum so low, I felt it in my teeth. I closed my eyes. Breath in, breath out. I let the doubts drift like pollen past a window I had no intention of opening. The hum calmed. Somewhere to my left, a spider finished a line and anchored it with a tiny tug. 30. Dawn is not a light so much as a tilt in what light is allowed to be. It came slowly, as if embarrassed to interrupt. The man watched the sky behind the trees with a look that made me think of a shopkeeper about to lock a door. The woman took her hand from the stone. It left no print. "Time," she whispered, and I felt the word land and stand. 31. The man sighed like someone putting away a tool still warm from the work. "Another day then," he said. He should have sounded resigned. He didn't. He sounded pleased in a small, private way that made my stomach turn. "You said until dawn," he reminded, and though I hadn't, not precisely, I didn't argue. The edge of the circle loosened. The forest's listening changed to something like eavesdropping, casual, uncommitted. He stepped back, and the marks on the bark seemed to recede, their ink drying. "You leave with all you brought," he said. "That's what you asked." He tipped his head at the woman with a cheerfulness that returned like a mask found and put on again. A tidy bargain. The woods can admire that. I didn't move. The relief I'd expected didn't arrive. "What did it keep?" I asked before I could decide not to. The man blinked as if I'd pinched him. "You kept the count," he said. "You leave with all you brought." He smiled wider. "But do you remember what you left at home?" The woman's hand found my wrist again, not so much to comfort as to prevent my weight from leaving my feet. "He tries to write the cost in past tense," she said. "Don't give him your yesterdays." The man laughed, soft and real. "You can't hold all your days," he said. "They leak." He looked at me with something like fondness. "You did better than most. The forest will be patient with you for a while." He stepped backward once, and it was like a curtain drawing. He wasn't there, and yet the space still felt occupied, as if the scent of a person had learned to stay after they'd gone. The woman let my wrist go. The stone's lines had lost their shine. The clearing seemed smaller in daylight, less like a room and more like a pause in a sentence. "Is it done?" I asked. My voice sounded to me like it belonged to someone who had slept deeply and woke in a chair they did not remember sitting in. "For now," she said. "The path will move. Don't look for it." I nodded, the way you nod when your body doesn't quite believe, but your mind has no safe choice but to agree. She waited. I felt the question she wasn't asking, the thing she needed to know to decide whether to walk me to the road or leave me with my own outline in the world. "What did you forget?" she asked finally, because even kindness must sometimes break its own rules. I opened my mouth and felt nothing missing. I closed it again, and the emptiness arrived late, like a letter forwarded too many times. It was small and silly, and it unraveled me. "My grandmother's kettle," I said. "I left it warming on my stove. It was old, with a dent on the side. She used to." I stopped because the next words were not there. Not the gesture she made when it whistled, not the song she hummed while pouring. I knew there had been a song. I knew the shape it made, the way it braided steam in Sunday mornings. But the tune itself was gone, cleanly, as if snipped out of the cloth. I could see the space it left, more real than the thing had been. Tears surprised me, not for the song, but for the neatness of its absence. The woman's face softened, which is not the same as pity. "It takes what it can reach," she said. "You left a door open in worry. It found a bit of you on the table." I wiped my face with the heel of my hand and felt suddenly foolish, as if crying at the price of a myth was like arguing with the tide. "It's small," I said. "It's nothing. It's yours," she said. "That's always the cost." I looked at the trees. Day had touched their edges. Birds were pretending to have always been awake. The path that had led me here did not exist anymore in the way paths usually do. The woman tilted her head toward a direction that was not the way we'd come. "I'll walk you to the road," she said. "You can find your car from there if you let the world be ordinary again." "And if I can't?" I asked. She smiled, and it was the first smile I believed. "Then you'll learn how to hold two kinds of quiet," she said. We left the clearing with the same care we'd used to enter it. The forest didn't mind. It had eaten and could wait. Our steps found a rhythm that matched the slow waking of the day, and the ground behaved like ground again. When we came to a place where the trees thinned and the scent of tar and sun-baked stone arrived like a familiar song you don't know the words to, the woman stopped. "You'll think about coming back," she said. "That's normal." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. She studied me as if making a small map she could fold and keep. "Don't come back because of loss," she said. "Come back because of choice. There's a quiet that belongs to you. The forest has its own." She stepped away as if the air between us had closed. "If you hear someone on the trail offer you the best clearing," she added, almost lightly, "say you already have your own." "Do you?" I asked. She glanced toward the trees, then to the sky, then back to me. "Sometimes," she said, "sometimes I borrow theirs." She turned and slipped into the woods like a sentence sliding into meaning. I stood on the hard shoulder of a road that looked ordinary enough to be rude. Cars hissed by as if water wanted to pretend to be metal. I walked toward where I'd left my car, and when I found it there was dew on the windshield and a piece of old leaf clinging to the wiper like a tiny hand. I drove back into the day's rough bright. I thought about breakfast and a shower and the way hot water pretends to be forgiveness. At a stoplight in a town that would have laughed at my story if I'd told it, I lifted my phone and pressed the button to call home so I could ask my neighbor to check the stove. I stopped with my thumb on the screen. The kettle could not be there. It was older than the stove and as faithful. The stove was off. The forest hadn't kept anything dangerous. It had kept a tune. For months after, I tried to hum the song that wasn't mine anymore. Sometimes, when the apartment was too loud with its own silver noises, I would hold my breath and listen for the small sounds, the radiator's click, the elevator cable's distant sigh, the thin complaint of a window settling. I counted them for no reason that would make sense to anyone else. 1, 2, 3. On a night when sleep had rolled away and left me its cool impression, I made tea in a new kettle that whistled with an unfamiliar pitch. I poured, and in the spill of steam I thought I heard a thread of something I had known once. I could have followed it, could have let it write an invitation in the fog of my mind, but I didn't. I let it leave without being named. There are nights when the city gets too loud, and I think about the woods, about the way the trees leaned to listen, and how the ground tilted into wrongness. There are mornings when I forget a word, and the gap where it should be feels perfectly cut. It doesn't frighten me anymore. It simply reminds me that you pay for the quiet that keeps you. And when someone on a trail nods at me with friendly rehearsal and says I won't find a better clearing before dark, I smile and say I already have my own, and I walk where the ferns are ordinary and the birds don't pretend to be new. I still sleep in a tent sometimes, not far from roads, where the only ritual is zippers and the smell of nylon and the slow bloom of stars. I still count, not because I'm afraid of losing, but because the count itself is a way to belong. When the wind pushes against the fabric and the trees sound like a river too far to find, I let the numbers arrive and pass, the distant bark of a dog, the clink of a small stone settling against a larger one, the whisper of my own breath turning over to become the beginning of sleep. If I ever return to those other paths, and some nights I think I will, I expect I will not be offered the same terms. The forest is old enough to hold a grudge as easily as it holds a secret. But I understand now that bargains are only stories with rules, and stories are only houses you agree to live in for a while. I have enough houses. I have a kettle that doesn't sing the same song but boils water all the same. I have a rule that belongs to me, and I have, even on the noisiest nights, a quiet that lets me drift, the kind that isn't empty so much as companionable, as if the world were keeping watch for me and would wake me if anything truly needed a name. Now, on to the next story. The bus dropped me at a stop that might once have had a sign. Salt lived in everything: the faded bench, the splintered post, the grass that leaned as if the wind had taught it manners. The sea lay out past a tangle of low roofs and nets, silver gray and patient. I'd come because the city had been shouting for months, and I'd started shouting back without moving my lips. A friend of a friend said there was a coastal town where time forgot to hurry. There were rooms to let above the old chandlery, quiet enough to sleep to, she joked, and something in me, tired and reckless, took the phrase literally. I dragged my duffel along a lane that narrowed until the houses had to behave like neighbors. Windows watched but didn't judge. Someone had hung fish to dry. They spun slowly, as if the air had its own slow conversations. The wind brought me church bell smell, old wood, beeswax, the breath of stone, and then the quick tarry-tang of boats. Half the doors were painted the same stubborn blue. I began to think I had made a good choice. The chandlery had a sign so worn it looked like an old scar. The window displayed ropes in even coils, pulleys that remembered weight, glass floats with their nets like cradles. Inside, light fell in tall, slanted sheets and showed dust floating the way minutes do when they have nowhere else to be. A bell I couldn't see announced me with a thin, polite chime. Upstairs, someone called, and I found the staircase by finding the smell of lemon oil and old steps. The boards announced me to the building. The top landing opened onto a hall that had learned to be narrow in the right places. A woman was there, expecting me with the patient air of someone who has seen all the versions of Arrival. Her hair was the color of driftwood that had spent a season pretending to be a tree again. She wore a cardigan that had outlived 3 winters and decided this one could be easy. "You're the one who needs quiet," she said without malice. "I kept the back room, best for sleeping. You won't hear the bell except when it wants to be heard." "I don't mind bells," I said, "because talking about bells is easier than talking about why you've come." She studied my face the way people in small places learn to do, with kindness that is not the same as softness. "Everyone minds bells in the end," she said, and handed me a key tied to a length of braided cord. The room was tidy in a way that had nothing to do with rules and everything to do with respect. Bed, small desk, chair with a cushion that remembered other people's careful bones. A window faced the water past the roofs, and when I opened it, the sea answered with a cool breath. The walls had been painted cream long enough ago that the color had decided to stay. In one corner, a shape under a cloth suggested a small cabinet or a large radio. I lifted the cloth and found a ship's clock the size of a dinner plate, brass that had dulled into elegance. The face was porcelain, hairline cracked like an old smile. The hands stood at 12 and 12, as if noon and midnight had found a truce. I touched the glass with one finger because sometimes it matters that something is real. My finger left no print. The glass felt colder than the room. A small key sat upright on the cabinet beside it, like a guest with perfect posture. I did not wind it, not because of superstition. Superstition arrives later, but because silence was the point of this trip, and I didn't want a ticking to keep me company if I wasn't the one who'd invited it. In the evening, I walked down to the harbor, where the boats leaned on the water like men waiting to confess, and then decided against it. Nets were spread like lace and weighted with stones that remembered the hands that had chosen them. Children played a game that involved chasing gulls and pretending to be surprised by their laughter. The pub door sagged with the weight of its own stories. Warm light framed shoulders, caps, the brief flash of teeth in a joke that didn't need words. I bought bread that looked like it knew how to be bread and cheese that tried to leak, and a small jar of pickled something that the shopkeeper promised would keep you honest. Honest seemed like a lot to ask from a jar, but I took it anyway. Back upstairs, I ate at the desk with the window open just enough to let the sea count without my help. The air moved through the curtains like a patient hand smoothing someone's hair. The town made its small mechanical sounds, gate latches, the shy clink of china, a cough from someone who didn't believe in closing windows, and then decided it had said enough. Night came without ceremony. I boiled water in the tiny kettle the landlady had left, its spout the shape of something trying to remember a bird. The tea tasted like leaves remembering sun. I slept, not perfectly. Sleep has to be coaxed and reminded and forgiven, but in large, decent pieces. I woke once to the far bell agreeing with the hour, once to the ferry's horn, and once to nothing at all, which is my favorite thing to wake to. In the morning, the mirror showed a face that had set a few burdens down and was pretending not to look back to make sure they stayed. The landlady met me on the stairs with a plate of something that had begun as scones, and then changed its mind halfway to becoming biscuits. "Town's small on first days," she said, as if giving directions. "It gets bigger if you're polite." "I can be polite," I said, and the ease in her eyes suggested that she believed me, or that it wouldn't matter if she didn't. The day arranged itself the way good days do, without asking your permission. I walked the long curve of the seawall, with my hands in my pockets, like someone from a painting. I watched a man mend a net with the tenderness of a tailor and the focus of a surgeon. I let a dog make up its mind about me and wag when it decided in my favor. At the far end of the wall, a lighthouse lifted itself like a polite finger. It was not tall, but it had that dignity some buildings acquire when they've watched long enough. A lightkeeper's house sat close by, now boarded, with its shingles painted that stubborn blue the town loved. The boards were clean and recent. Someone had felt responsible. On my way back, I noticed a building I'd missed, not because it hovered or glowed or spoke, but because it failed to do all three, and thus hid in the space your mind leaves for unimportant things. It sat at the landward end of a narrow street that didn't like being a street. The facade was brick, the color of dried blood. 2 windows stared at nothing, and between them a doorway taller than needed wore a faded lintel that might have once told a name. I would have walked past if the air hadn't changed. The way rooms change when you open a door to the hall and your body recognizes other breathing. I felt watched from inside by something that didn't care whether I came in or not. When I reached the chandlery, the landlady was at the counter, turning a coil of rope, the way one might turn a thought. "You found the lighthouse," she said without asking. Salt had tattled on me. "Stay away from the steps after rain. They go loose." "I saw a boarded house," I said, "by the light." "Boarded things have their reasons," she said, as if that could be the end of it. "And down by the long net shed," I added carefully, "there's a brick building, tall doorway." Her hands slowed on the rope, only a fraction. "There is," she agreed, with the neutrality of someone describing weather that wasn't hers. "Used to be the signal hall, then a schoolroom for a bit when the church roof tried being a sieve. Then it was nothing for longer. It changes its mind. Can it be visited? It can be looked at," she said, and left it there, which is a form of generosity. That night the wind came up and played the chimneys like awkward flutes. The sea changed its mind about patience and fussed against the wall. Above the cabinet, the ship's clock faced the room with the composure of a portrait. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt that particular loneliness you get in new rooms, the kind that isn't about missing people, but about missing your own outline. To make an outline, I decided to do something ordinary. I put the key in the clock's small mouth. The resistance was intimate, like turning a ring on a swollen finger. The mainspring took the wind in steady swallows. A sound rose that was not a sound yet, the promise tucked deep in the brass. When it was enough, I stopped. I rested my thumb on the glass as if taking a pulse. For a breath, nothing, then the most courteous tick, a polite nib at the edge of the room, another precisely following, as if the first had invited a friend. The hands did not move, the ticks did. I watched long enough to understand that time would agree to be lived here on terms I could live with. I slept with that permission. The dream, when it came, arrived like a visitor who knows the back stairs. I stood by the seawall at a tide my waking feet did not know. The water had drawn away until the harbor showed its bones, posts furry with weed, stone teeth, forgotten ladders. People moved on the wet sand with the slowness of those who work inside weather. Their clothes belonged to another century, but their hands did not. They were simply human, and work makes time behave. A bell rang, not from the church, not from a boat. It rang once, a note fat with iron, and the working slowed. Another ring, and the slowing became stillness. Heads lifted. No one looked at the sound. They looked toward the land. I turned with them. The brick building stood where it stands. The tall doorway was filled with nothing, or with the idea of a person. My dream eyes could not decide. The air between the doorway and the stopped people tightened. A woman beside me, dream woman, old, with a scarf tied like a habit of mind, touched my sleeve with 2 fingers. "Go careful," she said, and though we had not been speaking, the kindness of warning lived in her voice. It hears itself when there's a storm. I woke with my skin remembering wet. The room held together around me, politely, tenderly. The tick continued, unchanged. Dawn had laid a soft hand along the window frame. The light had that infant tint that makes you forgive everything. I went down early because being among old wood felt like medicine, and because the landlady's kettle made a noise that hurt my bones. "You look like something spoke your name, and you pretended not to hear," she said, handing me a mug that could have been a bowl if it had tried harder. Storm dreams. They come on strong when the wind goes east. "There was a bell," I said, "not the church." "The signal bell," she said. "Before we had wires, before the wires decided to be lazy. You heard what the town used to hear when the sea had an argument with itself. Funny for you to hear it now. We've not had a proper east wind night in weeks." "You heard it?" I asked, because shared delusion is easier to carry than the solitary kind. "We always hear it," she said, and then smiled in a way that could be an apology. "We've learned to be polite to it." After breakfast, I took the long route that pretends not to end at the brick building, and then does. The lane pinched, the ivy leaned, the daylight became selective. Up close, the bricks were handmade, pocked and irregular, each one containing its own small history of heat. The lintel had letters if you let your eyes squint. I didn't. The doorway, taller than any door the town owned now, stood open to shadow. The interior smelled like old paper, minerals, and a hint of salt that had learned manners. I didn't cross the threshold, not because I was wise, but because I wanted to keep the option of caution. I stood in the mouth of it and let my eyes do the work. Benches, narrow, their surfaces polished by vanished patience. A table at the front where someone once sat to tell the weather what story it was allowed to be. A rack where flags might have hung, their meaning retired. On the right-hand wall, the ghost of a chalkboard drew a rectangle so convincing that my brain wrote letters on it and then was embarrassed. In the back, near the high windows, a rope hung as if it had just remembered gravity. It moved once in a breath that did not belong to me. Every place has its own quiet. This quiet liked to be counted, and suddenly I understood why I had wound the clock, why I slept at all. Counting makes a shape. Shapes keep you. I counted the sounds I could hear and did not add numbers to the ones my mind tried to invent. The hum of a fly that had gotten old in the same room, the shift of a board that disliked damp, a far gull deciding that complaining wasn't worth it. 3, 4, 5. The rope did not move again, which seemed like a courtesy extended. Looking, someone said behind me, and I turned too quickly and did that flinch you do when you expect a stranger and find one who thinks you know them. He was a man in his 60s with the contented muscle of someone who still lifts things the right way. He wore a cap that had belonged to his father. I could see the inheritance in the way his head fit beneath its brim. He nodded toward the interior. It makes you polite, doesn't it? I thought that was me, I said. It is, until it isn't, he answered, and then stuck out a hand with a name attached. I took it and gave mine back. He rolled my name on his tongue like something he might offer to a friend later, and then tipped his chin toward the sea. You'll know it by noon, he said. The wind's gone nervy. Don't stand under the big door after 3. It drops its own shade when it's cross. The practical absurdity of the warning worked better than a story. I'll keep to the small doors, I promised. He smiled as if I had passed a test he hadn't meant me to take. That'll keep you, he said, and went on his way the way people in small places do, with purpose you can't quite see but believe in. I left the threshold and stepped into the day like stepping into a coat you hope will fit. The town went about its business with the neat choreography of habit. Children ran and didn't fall. Women leaned on door frames and wiped their hands. Men counted something invisible with their eyes and found it satisfactory. By noon the wind had indeed gone nervy. It worried ropes and made the gulls change their minds mid-sentence. Clouds lined up in a way that suggested gossip. Back in my room, the clock ticked with the same courteous rhythm, as if untouched by any other pulse. I put the key beside it and sat at the desk and wrote nothing, which is a kind of writing. The open window let in a sliver of the town's collective breath. The brass face held the room. The hands still pointed at 12, perfectly balanced, as though time here was a coin stood on edge and too polite to fall. I meant to nap and instead watched the way light goes tender at the edges of afternoon. A smell like wet iron arrived ahead of any rain. Somewhere a door shut with more meaning than necessary. When the first drop hit the sill, the second didn't wait. The storm tightened the world, the way a belt tightens a coat. I closed the window halfway, and the sound of the rain became the sound of someone hushing a room. The clock ticked on. The rope in the signal hall would be moving, I thought, without knowing why I'd thought it. I told myself to stay where I was, to be grateful for a room that was on my side. The bell rang. Not the church, not the ferry. A single fat note, iron-fed and sure, that came from a place I could have pointed to if I had let my hand betray me. The sound sat in the air like a guest who'd taken the best chair. The second ring followed, and with it the old dream sensation, the town deciding to hold its breath. Footsteps paused. Words finished themselves early. Rain reconsidered. There was a space shaped like listening. I stood without meaning to. My hand found the key, because hands are old creatures and love talismans. I didn't lock the door. I wasn't leaving. I only wanted the small weight of intention in my fingers. The clock did not hurry or slow. It ticked the way the sea breathes when it sleeps. I counted the silence after the second bell, because counting gives quiet a spine. 1, 2, 3. Somewhere downstairs the landlady moved a chair slightly out of true. 4, 5, 6. The seventh beat never arrived because the third bell came then, and it contained something the others hadn't, a decision made somewhere else. I thought of the tall doorway, and the rope, and the advice about small doors. I was not going out into the rain. I was not going down to stand under anything. I was going to sit on my bed like a person who wants to keep being a person and wait until the hour went back to being an hour instead of a mouth. The fourth bell climbed the stairs without feet. It set itself gently on the cabinet, as if the brass could keep it company. The key in my hand warmed, the way metal does when it agrees with you. I breathed in time with the tick and out in time with the rain. It is astonishing how much a body can teach you when you stop telling it what to do. The fifth bell didn't come. The quiet that followed it had edges. They were not sharp. They were precise. I thought, without wanting to, of the brick building and its shadow-dropping temper. I thought of the town's practiced politeness, of the way people look at weather as if it were not outside them. I thought of the dream and the woman who had touched my sleeve and told me to go careful. The sixth bell arrived late, as if it had had to be convinced. The seventh came right behind it, almost apologetic. The eighth was far away, a rumor. The ninth was so close I knew exactly where it had been rung. The 10th held breath and let it go. 11 never bothered. 12 happened inside the clock without moving the hands. I sat on the bed until my body realized that sitting was an action and would have to be paid for later. When the rain softened, I stood and opened the window again. The town exhaled. A child cried in the way children cry when no one is hurt. Boots went down steps. The sea returned to its muttering. The clock ticked on, kind and exact. That night I slept badly, because sometimes the cost is not fear, but wakefulness. I woke to the sound of net floats knocking together like old friends, then to nothing, then to the particular whisper of a foot on the hall, the landlady's, measured and soft. Near dawn I dreamed again, not of work on the sand, not of people stopping mid-gesture, but of standing in the tall doorway and being tall enough for it. The rope lifted, as if a hand were under it. I put my hand where a hand might be, and felt something like breath pass through. It didn't belong to me, and it didn't ask to. It just went on. When I woke, my palm tingled the way it does after you snap a matchstick and don't light it. By morning, the town had decided to pretend the storm had been polite. The landlady set a mug in front of me and asked if I'd slept, and when I shook my head, she nodded like a woman agreeing with weather. "It hears itself in the rain," she said again, as if reminding me of a rule I had already been taught. "And when it hears itself, it's best to count your own house." I carried my mug to the window and looked at the water that was already forgetting. The brick building sat as it sits. The doorway was a mouth closed on its own opinions. I told myself I would not go near it until the wind had changed, until the town had stopped holding its breath. I told myself I would be the sort of person who stays in when the old bell tries to organize you. I finished my tea, thanked the landlady, and put on my coat. Outside, the air had been laundered. The gulls had forgiven the wind. I walked with my hands in my pockets and told the day I was only going as far as the seawall. It agreed to believe me. I did what people do when they are going to break a rule. I made a smaller rule first and kept it. I stood on the wall and counted waves. I touched the iron rail and did not lick the salt from my fingers. I waved at the dog that had accepted me. I turned inland when I said I would. I walked up the lane that pretends not to lead to the brick building at all. Somewhere behind me, the clock upstairs ticked 2 careful beats I did not hear. Somewhere ahead of me, the rope in the signal hall moved without learning anything new. I stopped at the doorway and stood under the small overhang that keeps rain puzzled. I did not go inside. I waited until the town's breathing matched mine. Then I spoke in a voice that surprised me with its calm. "I'm only looking," I said to no one, and to the building, and to a version of myself that needed to hear it. "I'll be polite." A draft crossed my face with the temperature of an old cellar. The boards underfoot made a sound like a memory getting up from a chair. Far inside the room, something that had been thinking for a long time decided to listen. I did not step over the threshold. I looked. I let the room look back. And somewhere beneath the floorboards, faint and steady and impossible, I heard a ticking that did not belong to my clock at all. The rope in the signal hall didn't move again while I stood there. and that felt like a kindness, the sort a place gives you when it wants to see if you'll take advantage. I kept my hands in my pockets and let the doorway frame the dark. If I leaned even a fraction, I would cross from polite visitor to something else, and I suspected the difference mattered more here than anywhere else I'd been. A gull cried above, sounding like it had forgotten the script. I turned away before the town decided I had overstayed. The lane welcomed me back without ceremony, narrow and damp smelling, ivy heavy with last night's storm. The sky was clearing in streaks, pale blue showing between veils of cloud, and the sea, though restless, seemed to be forgiving. My feet carried me back to the chandlery as if it had been written in the floorboards. Inside, the air was warmer, scented with salt and rope and the faint citrus tang of the oil the landlady used. She was behind the counter winding twine with patient fingers, eyes narrowing slightly when she saw me. "You've been where you shouldn't," she said, not as an accusation but as a statement of geography. "I only looked," I admitted. "That's how it begins," she replied, but not unkindly. She tapped the counter once with the flat of her hand, the way you quiet a table of children. "There are rules. If you keep them, you'll find sleep. If you don't, you'll find stories. Stories don't let people rest." I wanted to ask her what rules, but the look she gave me told me she wouldn't answer in a list. She would wait for me to discover them, the way you wait for a child to understand that the stove is hot without saying the word burn. I went upstairs instead, feeling the old wood creak underfoot, the ship's clock keeping time in polite, exact strokes. It hadn't moved its hands from 12, but the ticking was steady as a heartbeat. The day stretched itself lazily. I tried to write, filling a page with words that looked like ants fleeing in different directions. They meant nothing, but the act steadied me. When my eyes grew heavy, I closed the notebook and stared at the brass clock face. I wondered who had first set it here, whether it had been gift or relic, whether it had arrived with its rules already attached. It ticked without hurry, each sound distinct enough to count, each count building a shape that felt more solid than the walls. By late afternoon, the air outside thickened again, as if the storm had been called back for an encore. The wind pressed against the shutters, and the gulls wheeled low, voicing their complaints. I stepped into the street and found the town subdued, doors closed, nets tied down, voices muffled behind glass. At the harbor, the boats strained at their lines like dogs that had caught the scent of something larger. The lighthouse stood steady, its boarded neighbor staring at nothing. The brick building at the far end of the net sheds seemed to grow taller with each gust, the doorway blacker than it had been that morning. I forced myself past it without looking, though the urge to glance sideways tugged at me like a hand on my coat. Back at the chandlery, the landlady was waiting with 2 mugs of tea already steaming. She handed me one, as though she had expected my return to be timed with the weather. "Storm's turning," she said. "When the east wind comes back, don't answer the bell." "I didn't last night," I said. "You woke," she replied. "That's answer enough." The storm broke just after dark, hurling itself at the roofs, rattling the windows, forcing the town to huddle against itself. Rain struck the shutters like handfuls of thrown gravel. I sat by the bed, the clock beside me, and listened as the storm tried to decide how loud it wanted to be. The first bell came as before, low and iron-fed, vibrating through the floorboards. It rang only once this time, and the silence after it was longer, heavier, more certain. My pulse tripped over itself. I pressed my palm to the brass clock, grounding myself in its steady rhythm. The second bell followed, and the storm seemed to pause to listen. The town below me stilled. I imagined every family sitting as I was, waiting, counting, holding their breath, as if their lungs could help keep the buildings upright. A third bell came, slower, dragging itself into the air like a chain pulled from water. My skin prickled. I thought of the rope in the hall moving with no wind, of the way the doorway had seemed to darken as I stood before it. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I counted 4, 5, 6. The ship's clock ticked evenly, as if reminding me that one set of rules had not changed. 7, 8, 9. The bells stopped. The rain returned to its clattering fury, but the silence that had stretched between those notes remained under everything like an undertow beneath waves. When sleep came, it did not come gently. I dreamed of the hall again. This time I stood inside it, though I knew I had not crossed the threshold. The benches were full of people whose faces blurred, their bodies still as statues. The rope swung in the center, slow and pendulum steady, though no bell was visible. The air felt thick, as though it had been folded too many times. I turned toward the tall doorway, but instead of shadow, I saw water pressing against it, held back by nothing but will. The sea itself waited on the other side, patient and immense. A hand brushed my shoulder, and I turned to see the dream woman again, scarf tied close, her eyes dark with warning. "Do not answer," she whispered, and the whole hall whispered with her, voices layering until they became the storm. I woke with the echo of it in my ears, my heart hammering against the cage of my ribs. Morning came reluctantly. The town was washed clean, but carried the tiredness of having braced itself all night. I walked the lanes and nodded to the people I passed. They nodded back with the weary solidarity of those who had shared the same unspoken vigil. At the harbor, the boats sagged against their lines, exhausted animals. Nets hung limp, their colors muted by rain. The brick building stood unchanged, though I thought I saw a faint dampness on the lintel, as if it had drunk deeply and not wiped its mouth. The man in the cap appeared again, carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. "You're still here," he said, as if that surprised him. "I'm still here," I agreed. "Then you've been polite enough," he said, setting the rope down to adjust his cap. "But mind yourself, it only gets hungrier." "What does?" I asked, though I already knew he would not answer. He gave me a look, sharp but not unkind. "You don't have to name it. Naming's half the invitation." He walked on, leaving me with the smell of salt and tar, and the realization that everyone in this town lived by rules they could not write down, rules you only learned by surviving the nights. Back in my room, the clock ticked steadily. Its hands had not moved, still fixed at 12 and 12, but I felt the minutes piling up in its rhythm. I wound it again, carefully, respectfully, and for a moment the storm dream seemed to loosen its grip. But as dusk approached, the air thickened once more, and I knew the night would not let me rest so easily. The third morning wore the same pale light as the first, but it knew me now. The town's faces knew me too, by the small adjustments people make when a stranger becomes part of the weather. The landlady set a saucer beside my mug without looking up. "The way you put out water for a cat that has been visiting. Wind turned last night," she said, and the way she said it made me taste east on the back of my tongue. "It'll try again tonight. They always try in threes." "How many threes?" I asked. "As many as it needs to remember itself," she replied, finishing a neat knot and pulling the rope to test it. "And as many as you need to remember yourself." I carried my tea to the window and watched the harbor remember how to breathe. Men coiled lines with hands that had learned patience from storms. Women beat rugs as if shaking sleep from them. Children stole each other's games and then traded them back. It would have been a comfort if comfort had been what I was here to find. Sleep is not comfort. Sleep is permission. There is a difference. I left the mug and walked the town with an intention I didn't entirely trust. I told myself I was looking for bread, for eggs, for something that tasted like morning. The truth was that my feet were going to the brick building because the part of me that insisted on politeness was losing to the part that insisted on knowing what rules I was being asked to keep. The lane narrowed. and the doorway grew out of it like a conclusion. The threshold held. The inside had shifted, but in the way a room shifts when light changes, everything in its place. But the place has learned a new expression. Dust motes hung squarely in a shaft of sun that found a high window and tested the air. The rope was still, but its stillness looked rehearsed. Benches waited with the patience of objects that have outlived owners. The chalkboard's ghost was less shy. Someone had dragged a fingertip across it recently, or last century. The space made its own time. I had the sense that if I stayed long enough, it would teach me to count differently. On the back wall, half hidden behind a stack of wooden crates, a cabinet stood like a person trying not to be asked a question. It was tall and narrow with a glass front gone smoky, its brass latch the only piece that remembered brightness. I told myself I would not touch it. I told myself I would only look the way I had promised. I stepped closer and found a ledger inside, bound in cracked leather, the color of dried kelp. No name lay on its spine. I didn't reach for it. The latch was a polite puzzle. I solved it without hearing the sound of my own breath deciding. The ledger was heavier than it looked. It had that weight some objects carry when they have not just recorded time, but stored it. When I opened it, the hinges sighed like old knees. Ink had been steady and modest here. Names of boats, dates, and weathers, notes on fog, on visibility, on the temperaments of distant shoals. Between the practical lines, a different hand had written quieter words, small script that had wanted to hide. It spoke of bells rung on still days, of a rope that moved when it shouldn't, of a doorway that made men feel tall or small, depending on whether they lied to it. The hand never signed itself. The entries came irregularly, like a confession given when courage was cheap. I read until my eyes felt salted. One line caught and stayed. We answer and we pay. We don't answer and we pay. The next line was a correction. Neither is free, but one lets us count our own houses. I closed the book because closing a book is sometimes the only respectful thing left to do. Found her, did you? A voice said, and I turned, guilt climbing my cheeks as if it had nails. The man in the cap stood in the doorway, hands empty, hat brim shading an expression that didn't require much of his face. She writes to keep the building honest. She? I asked too quickly, betraying the hope that the ledger had a shape beyond ink and weather. The keeper's girl, he said, not the child of his house, the child of the place. Every hall has one when it's busy, someone the wood talks to when there's no one else listening. They get good at not telling what they know. They get better at telling the page. You read enough of her and you'll begin to hear her walk. I didn't mean to, I began, and he cut me off with a small motion, a kindness for my clumsy apology. It's why it's there, he said. An unlocked cabinet is its own instruction. Just remember to put it back where the room can find it. He stepped inside for the first time since I'd known him, and the hall accepted him the way a chair accepts an owner. He didn't hurry. He walked the aisle as if blessing benches. At the rope he stopped and set his palm against it, not moving it, letting the rope recognize his hand and decide to be still. We used to ring for ships, he said to the air. Then we rang for weather. Now and then we ring for ourselves, so we don't forget there's a difference. Do you ring when it storms? I asked. We ring when it's quiet enough to hear us, he said. Storms do their own ringing. He gave the rope a friendly pat. You'll hear it sing to itself when it's bored. That's when you leave it alone. He glanced at the ledger and at me, not disapproving, not approving, just measuring the space between me and the room. You wound the time upstairs, he added. Good. It's an old clock. It needs company more than key. How did you? He smiled with half his mouth. Town tells, he said. Rooms tell better. He tipped his cap a fraction and left the hall without looking back, which struck me as the bravest way to exit a place like this. I put the ledger gently where it had stood, smoothed the leather spine as if stroking a cat, and latched the cabinet with the modest firmness of someone who has practiced becoming a better guest. Outside, the day had learned to squint. A high haze flattened distance. The lighthouse's white looked less like paint and more like bone. I walked down to the seawall and let the water do its old trick of forgiving everything. In that forgiving, I felt the pull of the boarded house beside the light. It had the particular magnetism of doors that used to be used, and now were not. I stood at its fence and looked without trespassing. 4 windows to a face, blind, a roof that had argued with the wind and lost a few shingles, steps leading to a porch that had memorized feet. An old bronze plaque kept its own counsel beside the gate. I leaned only close enough to read the years the house had been a house, the name of a keeper who had outlived 2 storms and been outlived by a third, and a line that did not make itself important, but was family quarters closed. That last word hummed, the way certain words hum when they are trying to be several things at once. I turned away before I had to guess which 2. Back at the chandlery, the landlady was mending a net that was too pretty to go near fish. "You'll have found paper in the hall," she said. "Not a question. It reads like listening," I said. "That's what good writing is," she answered. "Listening with a place instead of to it." She worked 3 clean stitches and bit off the line. "If you stay long enough, you'll learn how people here tell weather as if it were gossip. Less harm in calling it that." "Do they talk to the building too?" I asked. "They talk to each other about not talking to it," she said dryly. "It's a method." She looked up at me then, a long look that made me set my hands on the counter like someone preparing to receive instruction. "There's something you'll want to understand before tonight," she said. "Every time it hears itself, it asks us a different question. We practice not answering the question it asks. We answer a different one. That's how we keep our own houses." "What questions does it ask?" I asked, knowing I wouldn't be told. "Old ones," she said, "the kind that make you name who you are and what you'd pay to keep from changing. Do not say your name out loud when it's ringing. Don't say anyone else's either. It's greedy with names. If you must speak, talk about your kettle and your bread and the way you like your socks folded. Or better, don't speak at all. Let your clock speak for you." She pushed the net aside and came around the counter with slow deliberation, as if she were bringing weather with her. She put something small and cold in my palm, a brass token stamped with a circle and a line through it. "Hold this when you don't know what the day is. It was made to refuse. It used to mean closed or done for now. It still remembers. Some metal keeps its meaning even when people forget." I closed my fingers around it. It fit too well, like a coin from a country I had visited without knowing. "Thank you," I said, and meant it as a promise, the only kind of thanks that matters. The afternoon slid over the town like a hand smoothing a sheet. The sky gathered itself along the horizon and turned the color of a bruise, deciding what story to tell. I ate bread and a piece of white fish that had been a fish a few hours ago. I drank tea because tea is a habit you can put around things you don't understand. Upstairs, the clock sounded glad to see me, which is a sentence that would have made no sense to me a week ago. I wound it and felt the spring accept the turn, like a favor granted. The hands remained where they had chosen to live, at the mutual agreement of midnight and noon. I sat with my back to the cabinet and listened to the building around me breathe. People coming home and then being home. Chairs finding the angle they like. Pipes remembering to be pipes. Somewhere a radio tried on 3 different songs and kept none. The light conspired with the brass and the cream walls to lay a calm over the bed that I almost trusted. Almost is enough, sometimes if you've planned for the part of the night that isn't. The first bell came earlier than before, a little impatient, as if it had been ready and we had kept it waiting. It found me sitting straight, hands on my thighs, coin in my palm, breath counting itself. The tick folded itself around the note, like a hand around a candle. The second bell had weight, the weight of ritual, and it disturbed nothing because everything had already made space for it. The third did not come for a long time. I felt it moving through the town in the length of the pause. Windows narrowed, eyes closed with intention, mouths made the shape of words, and then did not let sound follow. When it finally arrived, the third note contained a question, the way a tide contains the moon. I could not hear the words, but I could feel the shape they wanted my mouth to make. You? It asked, but not in English, not in any language, just in that old way some places ask you to stand where you are and be counted. It asked for my name, for the one the town used, and the one I used alone. I kept my mouth closed and let the clock say it for me. Tick I am, tick I am, tick I am. I held the coin and felt its refusal steady, the edges of my hand. The room seemed to lean, not toward the bell but toward me, as if deciding whether I understood what I owed it. I put my feet flat on the floor and remembered the ledger's line, neither is free, but one lets us count our own houses. I counted. One house, mine, a bed, a cabinet, a clock that liked company, a window that looked at water and did not ask for anything back, a landlady who told me the difference between quiet and sleep. The counting happened without numbers. It happened in objects and breath. The fourth bell came from farther away, small and almost shy, like a child deciding to join a game. The fifth followed fast and sounded like it had been rung with hands that did not know their own strength. The sixth and seventh were rumors, the kind of sounds you get when memory tries to ring. The eighth came from the brick building, even though I wasn't there. I knew it because my teeth understood the distance. The ninth did not ring at all. Something else did. A sound between wood and water, between rope and throat. It filled the space in me that fear usually finds. The coin cooled again. I stayed where I was and let my lungs make a pattern that the room could learn. The 10th bell asked a smaller question. I answered with the room. The 11th did not ask anything. It only reminded me that questions could be asked forever. The 12th happened in my bones. After, the rain didn't come. The silence did. It was not the politeness of a town going to bed. It was the hush of a building, remembering its history aloud, and then deciding to be quiet for your sake. I slept then, not because I had earned it, but because I had been given it for a while. The dream that followed was neither the hall nor the wall nor the sea. It was a kitchen, not mine, not the landlady's. The table was scrubbed bare and waited for hands. A kettle sat on a stove that knew how to be useful. In the corner, a child's shoes waited, toes pointing at each other in conspiratorial talk. The ship's clock hung above the door, and its hands did not move, but its tick could be felt in the way steam lifted. The door opened, and a girl came in with rope burns on her palms and ink on her wrist. She looked at me with the plain gravity of someone who has seen the sea argue with itself and win twice. When it asks, she said, ask it back. She set a small brass coin on the table and slid it across as if paying for bread. Your house, she added, and I woke with my hand already closed. At dawn, the town had the restful guilt of a place that has managed to get away with something. The landlady's cardigan looked less tired. The man in the cap walked by the window and tipped 2 fingers to the glass without seeing me. I wanted eggs and got them scrambled into submission, piled next to bread that sang when you broke it. Between bites, I told the landlady I had been polite. She accepted the report with a nod that understood there had been temptations and that I had done what I could. You'll go back to the hall today, she said, neutral as a forecast. It will be different. It always is after it's rung. Should I asked. Wanting and shoulding are different maps, she said. If you go, don't take your questions where the pictures can see them. Look at the floor. Floors know things without getting proud about it. I went because I did. The lane seemed shorter, the doorway taller. The air in the hall had been washed and hung to dry. The rope looked ordinary, and that more than anything made me wary. Benches had gathered a skin of dust again, enough to make me think a night had passed in which the room had been alone. The chalkboard ghost had decided to be bolder. I could now read a word I could not make sense of. Keep, not keep out, not keep off. Just keep, as if the sentence had been waiting to finish itself. The cabinet stood where I had left it. The ledger, when I opened it, had turned its own page. Newer entries, strange because newer here meant perhaps a generation ago. The hand that had written the secret lines had grown more confident, more sparing. She had begun to put questions into her notes, not just answers. What do we owe the bell? Why does it ask when it knows? What does it keep when we don't answer? Some entries were short, almost empty, as if she'd been called away mid-thought. Once she had written a date, and nothing else, and the date was the day the plaque at the lighthouse house had told me was an ending. I closed the book because my throat hurt. I found a bench with a view of nothing but floor, and sat with the posture of someone who is practicing not to cry. The rope lifted in my peripheral vision by the thickness of a breath, and settled again, as if a hand had changed its mind about touching it. Ask it back, the girl in the dream had said. I could say nothing tonight, and that would be good. Or I could say something that belonged to me. I could ask the bell a question it didn't want, and maybe that would be a way to keep my house. Footsteps in the doorway announced the cat before his voice did. Learned something, he said. It wasn't a guess or an accusation. It was a fact about a person in a room. I think so, I said. I don't know how to use it. You don't use it, he said. You live with it. He came to the bench and sat one person away, which is the correct distance for conversations in rooms that listen. The building will take your answers. It cannot bear your questions. That's the joke we make to keep ourselves from thinking too long. But there's a truth in it. Ask it something it can't ring. Ask it what it owes us. Ask it what it keeps when we don't speak. Ask it how many houses it knows by heart. He tilted his chin at the rope. It doesn't like arithmetic. Will that make it go quiet? I asked. It will make it be what it is, he said, and that is enough. You can sleep in a town that knows what it is. We sat like that long enough for the room to mistake us for furniture. When he left, he took some of the room's attention with him, and I loved him for that small theft. I stood and walked to the threshold and looked at the town, which was doing its best to be ordinary and mostly succeeding. I went back to the chandlery and bought a length of cord I didn't need. The landlady cut it and handed me the extra piece as a tip, which is how small places tell you they've decided you can belong a little. Afternoon slowed to the hour when curtains consider closing and decide it's too soon. I ate early out of a superstition I refused to admit was superstition. I wound the clock and thanked it out loud, because gratitude is not always a trap if you mean it for the right thing. I sat with the coin in my palm and my feet on the floor, and my questions lined up like good china. The sky blued itself into indifference. The first bell arrived with precision. It sounded less like a demand and more like a default. The second was gentle, which unsettled me more than iron. The third took its time coiling through the town. When it got to me, I was ready. When the shape of my name tried to form on my tongue, I held the coin and asked the room back, with no voice, only the terrible impatience of thought. What do you keep when we do not answer? The question did not make a sound. It made a shape that leaned outward instead of in. The fourth bell stumbled over it. The fifth went around. The sixth arrived late, as if it had gone to ask permission. I asked again, how many houses do you know by heart? The clock delighted in this. It ticked with a little pride, as if I had offered it a toy and it had learned a new trick. The seventh bell sounded different to me, hollow in a way that might have been relief. The eighth was proud, and then ashamed of being proud. The ninth and 10th tried to harmonize, and couldn't, like siblings caught telling different versions of the same story. The 11th let the rain into its throat. The 12th happened where it always does now, somewhere that can't be seen. The quiet that followed had a different density. It did not thicken to a warning. It lay down like a dog under the table and went to sleep. I breathed and remembered to breathe, and then didn't have to remember. The coin cooled. The clock kept me. Something under the floorboards ticked again, and I realized it wasn't a clock at all, but the building's own habit of being alive. The habit relaxed. Mine did too. I slept in large pieces that fitted together when I woke. Morning came with the sound of a cart and someone laughing at the idea of weather having a plan. The landlady's face looked like a sky that had made up with the wind. She put jam on the counter and didn't ask me anything she already knew. I told her anyway. She listened until I was done and then wiped a small spill with the corner of her apron, an act that always feels like a benediction. "You'll be wanting to leave soon," she said, as if this were the natural consequence of a night well managed. "Soon," I said, feeling it. Not a rejection. A season ending. "One more sleep," I added, and she nodded. "Best to go on an odd number," she said. "Even numbers pretend to be finished and then surprise you." The day behaved. The hall pretended I didn't exist, and I returned the courtesy. I walked the seawall, and the dog approved of my choices. The boarded house by the lighthouse was the same, and not the same. How could it be? Its shutters set like eyelids in a dream where they have decided to stay closed. I touched the small brass plaque at the gate, and the metal was warmer than the air. I said aloud, "To the kind of listening that doesn't eat nouns, I am keeping my own house," and the wind agreed not to make that into anything else. Evening sat on the roofs in the way that tells you it will not get up again until it wants to. I went upstairs early and opened the window a fraction so the sea could keep me honest. I wound the clock and set the key down and counted the ticks until I could not separate one from another. When the bells came, if they came, I planned to let them ring to themselves and ask them nothing and answer them less. Not defiance, fatigue, the good kind. I must have slept before the first note, because the thing that woke me was not iron but cloth, the soft rubbing of rope in a high room, far away and as intimate as a whisper from the next pillow. I lay still and knew the hall had decided to ring to itself without asking for an audience. A blessing then disguised as omission. The second sound was water not moving. The third was my clock reminding my bones. I let the night go where it wanted to go. When the rain finally came, it came in soft handfuls, like someone rinsing their hair under an old tap. I slept all the way through the hour and woke in the light with no shape of a question in my mouth. In the morning, the town's faces said goodbye in their own alphabet. A nod, a coil thrown more neatly than needed, a loaf set a little heavier in its paper, a dog showing me its side instead of its teeth. The landlady wrapped the brass coin in brown paper as if it were a pastry and pressed it into my hand with an expression that forbade refusal. "You can post it back when you're sure," she said, "or keep it and be sure that way. I'll pay for it," I began, and she flicked a look at me so swift and dry it burned. "You will not," she said. "You'll keep it or you'll return it, or you'll forget you ever had it and find it when you need it. That's the cost." She reached behind the counter and produced a folded sheet, a rubbing someone had taken from a plaque years ago. The letters came through like ghosts asserting themselves. She slid it into my bag. "In case your house needs to remember another house," she said. I walked down to the seawall one last time because ritual steals the teeth from endings. The water was unambitious, and so was the sky. The brick building was what it is. The hall would ring again when it wanted to, and the town would be polite until it had a reason not to be. I stood there with my hands in my pockets and let myself be small and human and temporary, and kept. When I turned back inland, the lane took me like it always had, narrow, damp smelling, ivy telling the same story in different leaves. The clock upstairs would tick until someone loved it, and then it would tick again. I had one more night before the bus, and the city, and the louder kinds of bells. I didn't dread them. I had a rule in my pocket and another in my chest. And as I passed the tall doorway for the last time that day, I looked straight ahead and asked it in my head, for the sake of truth and practice both, "What do you owe us?" The building did not answer because buildings don't. The wind did, a little, and the ropes at the harbor and something under the floorboards went on living, and that was the only answer I needed to carry through one more sleep. The last morning began with a sky so pale it seemed embarrassed by itself. The gulls were slow to argue, the water slow to rise. I woke before the landlady knocked, before the clock had a chance to remind me, and lay in bed listening to a room that had learned to know me. The brass face glowed faintly in the dim light, its hands still and sure at 12 and 12. I wound it one final time, not out of duty, but gratitude, the way you pat a dog's head before leaving, knowing the dog will forgive you. The key turned smooth, like it had been waiting for this last winding. Downstairs, the landlady had already set the kettle to fuss. "Odd numbers are the best," she said, handing me toast dark enough to count as bread's other self. 3 nights, 5 nights, 7. You'll leave on 5. That's proper. I thought I'd only come for quiet, I said. I didn't expect to come for rules. That's what quiet is, she answered, spreading butter with small decisive strokes. Just rules nobody's written down yet. I walked the lanes as if saying goodbye in syllables. The boarded lighthouse house stood with its patience. The plaque gleamed dully. I touched it again, and this time said nothing, not even in my head. The brick building kept its doorway tall, and its lintel unreadable. I walked past without slowing, but the corner of my eye remembered the rope, and the ledger, and the girl in the dream. My hand closed around the coin in my pocket, the brass cool and persuasive. The bus would not come until the following dawn. One last night, the town carried itself through the day, as though pretending storms had been invented elsewhere. Nets dried, children quarreled, men mended, women stood indoors and spoke to weather like an old friend. The landlady hummed tunelessly while brushing down the counter. I tried to write again, but the paper resisted words. All I could manage were sketches, the angle of the rope, the way the light from the high window fell like a blade, the look in the cabman's eyes when he told me not to name things aloud. Evening came as if rehearsed. I ate bread and cheese, poured tea, and set the cup beside the clock. The sea muttered softly beyond the walls. A wind gathered itself along the horizon. I opened the window a fraction, enough for the salt to come in, and sat on the bed with the coin in my palm. The first bell rang at twilight, when the gulls were deciding whether to shut up for the night. It was quieter than before, but clearer, like a voice that had given up pretending to be polite. The town hushed around it. I felt the stillness settle into the walls, into my bones. The second bell came slower, deliberate, savoring its place in the air. My mouth wanted to answer with a name. I pressed the coin harder into my palm. The clock ticked gently, kindly. The third bell did not come. Instead, a new sound, rope creaking, high and distant, like the hall had decided to ring without iron, to let hemp and air carry its question. The sound spread until the whole room seemed woven with it. The walls leaned closer. The ledger's words returned to me. Neither is free, but one lets us count our own houses. I tried to count. Bed, cabinet, clock, window. Bread crust left on the desk. Landlady humming below. My body, still mine. Then the rope's sound changed. It became a voice, not quite male, not quite female, but old, as if time itself had decided to ask. The words did not belong to language, yet I understood. What will you give me? I almost said nothing. I almost said everything. Instead, I remembered the dream girl's command, Ask it back. So I asked, silently, fiercely, "What do you give me?" The rope hushed, as if taken aback. The storm paused outside. The silence thickened until I thought it would press my chest flat. The fourth bell struck then, louder than any before, but cracked, flawed, as if it had split against my question. The fifth and sixth followed quickly, almost panicked. The seventh came late, dragging itself. The eighth did not come at all. The ninth rose inside my own head, a whisper like a tide pulling at my thoughts. I pushed it away with the coin, with the clock's tick, with my stubborn insistence on the small toast, tea, the landlady's cardigan, the way the dog wagged its tail on the wall. The 10th bell asked nothing. The 11th rang like laughter heard through walls. The 12th came in the bones of the building, in the floorboards, in the very air. Then all was quiet again. I sat unmoving for a long time, afraid to breathe, afraid not to. At last I whispered aloud, breaking my own rule, "I am keeping my house." The words were small, but they steadied me. The rope fell silent. The hall, wherever it was in the night, let me go. Sleep came in heavy pieces. My dream was of the kitchen again, the kettle steaming, the shoes in the corner. The girl sat at the table, older now, her eyes weary but proud. "You asked," she said, "and you will keep asking. That's enough. Leave while you can, and don't look back more than twice." She slid the coin across the table. It was the same coin I held in my dream hand. I woke with it still warm in my real one. The last dawn came bright and cold. The town bustled like nothing had happened, like nothing ever did. People nodded, children laughed, gulls argued, nets mended. Ordinary life, layered over the extraordinary, as carefully as cloth over a clock. I carried my duffel down the stairs, the landlady waiting with a parcel of bread and cheese wrapped in wax paper. "You'll go now," she said. "5 nights. That's proper." "Thank you," I said, "for everything." "You'll remember to count," she replied. "That's all I ask." Outside, the bus idled, its paint dulled by salt, its windows clouded by sleep. I looked once toward the lighthouse house, its shutters shut against history, once toward the brick hall, its doorway tall and unrepentant, twice, just as the dream girl had said. Then I stepped onto the bus. The town slipped away, roofs shrinking, nets blurring, the sea a silver thread unraveling. I kept the coin in my pocket and the tick of the ship's clock in my memory. Behind me the bells would ring again, questions asked and refused, houses kept and lost. Ahead of me the city waited with its louder clocks and louder rules. But I carried mine now. I carried the habit of counting. I carried the silence that listens. And in that silence, I thought perhaps sleep will finally come when I ask it. Now, on to the next story. The job was simple, on paper, which is the way certain jobs like to be. Night digitization assistant, temporary contract, graveyard shift. Arrive at 9:45 p.m., sign the ledger, collect the key card and the card of file boxes, scan insurance documents from the 1950s that smelled faintly of smoke and winter, upload, verify, return to boxes to the cage, leave by 6:10 a.m., no client contact, no phone calls. Building security would be a single guard on the mezzanine. If I needed anything, there was a radio with a cracked antenna that only talked to the mezzanine in short, courteous bursts. The email ended. "Please observe after-hours protocols. They're mostly about quiet." The building had a name the way old ships have names. Whittemore and Glass, 1928, carved over the door. Limestone softened by a century of weather and hands. It had not tried to be tall, but it had tried to be right. Brass, marble, blunted edges of stairs worn by shoes that knew how to be shoes. I stepped in, and the echo did that thing echoes do in good lobbies, announce you to the building in a voice kinder than your own. The guard on the mezzanine leaned over the rail like an usher. He had the face of a person who had learned to nap with his eyes open. A blue blazer hung from a hook behind him, dignified even off his shoulders. Night digitization, I said, raising one hand as if hailing a cab. First shift. Then you're early, he replied, checking a clipboard with a pencil that had been sharpened into stubbornness. That's the best way to arrive anywhere. Name? I gave it and watched him find it like a word in a prayer book. He nodded, satisfied, and pointed at a book the size of a pizza box sitting on the marble table below his perch. The cover was leather cracked into maps. A pen lay diagonally across it. Not modern, not antique, just permanent. Sign where it wants you, he said, which I disliked for reasons I couldn't name. Below that, practicalities. Keycards in the drawer. Third floor is archives. Backroom lights are on a timer. Scanner's temperamental. If it pretends to jam on the second pull, feed the page again upside down. Makes it think it won. I signed. The paper took the ink with a thirsty satisfaction, the way plants take rain. My name looked sensible there, as if it had been waiting for this particular calligraphy its whole life. The guard watched my hand, and then glanced at a clock that had been keeping time since laws wore hats. After-hours protocols are on the placard by the elevator, he said. They're simple. Follow them like you mean it. The placard was brass, etched shallowly, polished by generations of reading. After-hours protocols, it said, as if I'd wandered into a club for polite ghosts. 1. Do not use the west stairwell between midnight and 3 a.m. It tends to repeat itself. 2. If the elevator stops on 4 when you pressed 3, step out, step back in, and press 3 again. Do not look down the hall. 3. Radios are for check-ins at the top of the hour. If you hear your name at any other time, it is the mezzanine, and we are testing you. Do not answer until 0. 4. Reflections after 2 a.m. are none of our business. 5. At 5:40 a.m., return the boxes to the cage, sign out exactly as you signed in, and leave by the north doors. The south doors are for day people. I read it twice, felt the smile forming on my face, a small amused thing at someone's idea of atmosphere. The guard didn't return it. They're there because we learned them, he said, and in his voice a long line of knights turned their heads to listen. The elevator had a crank-era dignity and a retrofit of buttons that had decided to be honest. I pressed 3. It considered. It rose. On the way up, the world stepped away in increments, and I saw myself in the faint metal, tired, a little hopeful, the color of my coat faded by old sun. I looked away to be polite to the placard. The third-floor corridor smelled like paper that had learned how to keep its breath. Lights hummed magnesium white. The archive door had a grill inset like a polite prison. Inside, steel shelves marched neat as an army, labels written in block letters with numbers that told a story of their own. The scanner sat on a table near the only window tall enough to feel like a posture, its surface a square of glass that remembered every set of hands that had wiped it. A rolling chair leaned against the wall, judging nothing. The radio crackled on the cart. Mezzanine, the guard's voice said. Check at the hour. Welcome to Whitmore and Glass. Copy, I said, because language bends to the room it's in. He didn't answer. The clock on the wall, age indeterminate, second hand limping on purpose, said 9:52. I had time to breathe. I did. The first box was light with letters from 1951. Fire claims, winter claims, a water damage report written in a hand that would have made a doctor envious. I fed them to the scanner and learned its moods. Don't rush. Don't press too hard on the glass. Flatten gently with your palm like calming a nervous horse. Pages that had been folded for decades remembered how to be flat with a sigh. I named the files sensibly so that future me could find them. Date, claim, initials that had faded into time. At 10 exactly, I pressed the radio's button. Third floor, I said, working. All well. Mezzanine, the guard replied. Heard. The building went about its gentle night chores. Air cycled. Ducks thought quietly. Far below, something heavy moved the way furniture moves when it tries to sit down without bothering anyone. I fell into a rhythm that belonged more to the room than to me. Feed, align, scan, check, name, return. Every 10th page I stood and left my body in the chair for a breath, the way you do when the task is good, but your bones have had a day. After a while, no timekeeping needed, just body footsteps entered the corridor and walked the floor like someone testing an instrument. I didn't hear the elevator. The steps began at the far angle and came toward the archive door with a steadiness that made me set my palm on the scanner glass to keep from moving. They stopped beside the window. Through the grill, I saw a shoulder in a gray suit, the color of old money, no face. The steps did not belong to the building, the way the guards did. They belonged to the hour itself. They paused as if reading. The radio stayed quiet. I stayed quiet. The steps went on toward the west stairwell, and then, without sound to justify it, I knew they had turned around and climbed down the same landing twice. Protocol 1 was, apparently, not a joke. I worked. Work is a bridge you build between yourself and a place. At 11 third floor. Working. Mezzanine. Heard. At 11:37, the scanner took offense at a perforated form and pretended to jam. I humored it, fed the page upside down, and it decided to be helpful again, gratified by my willingness to let it win. At 11:50, I stood to stretch and saw my reflection in the window glass superimposed overnight. My face looked patient. The room behind me looked like a set that knew its lines. The second hand kept its limp. The radio stayed uninterested. Midnight had a weight in this building. You could feel it settle into the marble, like a coin dropping into a jar. At 12 I pressed the radio and said my piece. The mezzanine's answer had a blink of delay, as if he had been talking to someone just then and had needed to excuse himself. Heard, he said. Mind the west stairs. I'm not using the stairs, I said, because I had learned to narrate my own safety. Elevator's loyal. Good, he said, and the line clicked back into its house. At 12:20, I needed the restroom, which lived 2 doors down, past the framed photographs of men in hats who had been called vice president when that job meant keeping keys and not much else. I took the radio because it felt like the sort of talisman you don't leave behind. The hallway echoed the way hallways echo when they have high ceilings and a memory for heels. In the mirror over the sink, the fluorescent light softened enough to make my face forgive me. I washed my hands long enough to feel like I had reset a clock. When I stepped back into the corridor, the elevator doors were open, framed by their own careful brass. I hadn't pressed the button. The car waited, lit, that mild square of space with a scuffed threshold that says, people. I stood where I was and let it wait. The doors did not mind. They hung open like a mouth prepared to tell a story, only if asked. I took one step forward, and the radio crackled once, not with voice but with that dry sound radios make when they are choosing their next word. Third floor, I said into it, a little too quickly. Bathroom break. Returning. Mezzanine, the guard said. Take your time. Don't rush the elevator. I began, and stopped. The elevator's light dimmed, and then brightened, as if it had blinked. I walked past it without stepping in, and felt something in the car's air consider me. Behind me, the doors closed without complaint. At 1, the check-in. At 1:14, the first real oddness. I pressed 3 on the elevator to return from a trip to the copy room, and the car took me to 4. The doors opened onto a hall with carpet, the color of a sleeping bruise, and lights that had decided to be soft. The placard's memory reached up and tapped my shoulder. Step out, step back in, press 3 again. Do not look down the hall. I followed the rule like I meant it. The carpet tried to be a horizon in my peripheral vision. The air smelled like flowers had been asked to behave. I did not look. Back in, button 3. The car corrected itself like a well-trained animal and took me where I belonged. At 1:30, a page with a single line in pencil made me sit longer than I needed to. Keep receipt if it burns twice. It was nothing, just a secretary's quick note from a day someone's office stank of singed dust. But the words accumulated weight in my mind, the way certain phrases do in certain rooms. Burns twice. I put the page to the glass and gave it the flattery of a good scan, as if respect could move backward in time. At 1:58, I realized I had been humming. I don't hum. The tune sloped up and down like a stair that turned on itself. I stopped. The radio woke itself. Mezzanine, the guard said before I could press the button. 2 minutes. I'm here, I said, and suddenly needed that to be true in more than one way. At 2:00, the radio clicked and the check-in was simple. At 2:06, the window glass decided to remember it was a mirror, and for a moment I saw the room behind me, not as it was, but as it wanted to be in a different year. The chair newer, the table darker, a fan in the corner pretending to make a difference. In that reflection, the door to the archive was closed. I felt my own hand reach up and rub my jaw, and in the glass the reflected hand did not. It took a breath and put itself down. I looked away because Protocol 4 was clear, and because I wanted the rule more than I wanted information. At 2:21, footsteps again, the same steady measure, the same kindness to the floor. They went past toward the west stairs. I counted them against the clock to test something. They reached the landing at 2:23, and then reached it again at 2:24. The rhythm was exact, the repetition patient, like someone reciting a poem to remember a dead person's middle name. I pressed my lips together and held very still until the poem ended. At 2:40, I opened a file that didn't belong in the box. Wrong year, wrong department. A small folder labeled Night Ledger, borrowed. Inside, a thin notebook bound in red cloth. Not the big book downstairs, a cousin, a pocket version. The pages were nearly empty. In neat, tired handwriting, a list. If the elevator breathes, you breathe slower. If the west stair repeats, count steps and do not correct. If the radio says your name after the hour, tell it about weather with no nouns. Do not let your reflections start the conversation. At 3:15, go get coffee. Bring a second cup. Put it on the table by the door. Return the cup to the sink at 4 on the dot. Dry it. Leave no proof of wet. There was a blot beneath the last line, a small drowned star. I looked at the scanner, at the clock, at the door. At 3:10, I found a clean ceramic mug in the cabinets under the sink, chalk white with a hairline crack that made it more honest. I poured from the ancient carafe in the copy room. The smell rose and did what coffee does, made courage an option. At 3:15, because someone else had done this before me and left instructions, I poured a second cup and set it on the table by the door to the archive, where the grill looked like it could keep something in and let someone see out. The steam made a shape, and then another, and then decided to be air. Nobody came. The coffee sat. My own cup cooled and tasted like a story whose ending you already knew. At 3:59, with a small, embarrassed feeling I couldn't shake, I took the untouched cup to the sink and washed it. The crack in the glaze darkened and then dried pale again. I put it back where I'd found it. The instructions had not been for me, I told myself. They had been for the hour. At 4, the radio breathed. Not the guard, not a voice, the sound of a room thinking. I pressed the button and said calmly, the weather with no nouns. It will be. It has been. It is not. It pretends to. It would like to. It might if we let it. The sound stopped politely, as if satisfied with my grammar. At 4:20, the scanner refused a page that looked normal. It slid halfway, hesitated, slid back. I checked the rollers. Fine. I flipped the page. Same refusal. Third try, it took the paper and made an image that was all dark, as if I'd laid my palm to the glass. Fourth try, the text appeared in perfect gray, but the date in the corner was wrong by a year, 1950, instead of 1951. I saved it with the name it insisted on and told myself that nothing prefers to be exact all night long. At 5, wariness came down soft across my shoulders, like a coat offered by a kind stranger. The building felt warm by then, the way old spaces do, after you've been gentle with them. The mezzanine answered crisply at the hour, sounding for the first time like he'd had coffee and let it be coffee. Coming home time, he said. Mind the north doors. Copy, I said, as if the word could hold me upright for the last hour. Protocol 5 circled in my head, neat and final. Boxes to the cage. Sign out exactly as I signed in. North doors. The scanner was suddenly eager to please. Pages flew, names settled, digital files lined up in their folder like well-behaved schoolchildren. At 5:32, the elevator came when I asked and took me to 3 instead of 4. At 5:37, I rolled the cart to the cage at the end of the corridor and slid the boxes into their slots, numbers returning to numbers like fish to water. I closed the padlock and felt it take my decision. At 5:40, exactly, I stood at the ledger in the archive to make the last notes I kept for myself, and noticed that the red notebook I'd returned to the borrowed folder was missing. The folder sat where I'd left it. The notebook was not inside. I did not look for it, not because I am noble, but because I had learned the weight of looking after certain hours. At 5:45, I pressed 1, and the elevator took me down. The brass rail under my hand, warmer than metal, has a right to be. The lobby was the kind that makes you quiet because the air has earned it. On the marble table, the big ledger waited with its pen lying diagonal, exactly where it wanted me. I signed out in the line that had been waiting to be complete, a simple echo of my own hand from hours earlier. The ink looked satisfied. The guard watched me with the approval reserved for people who've taken instruction well. First night's the whole degree, he said, and picked up his pencil. The rest is practicum. I read the placard, I said. They're not jokes. No, he said, they're manners. He looked past me to the south doors, glass darker than it should be, as if the night had left part of itself there. North, he reminded, day folks can have the south. I turned to go and remembered the coffee. I didn't say anything. He didn't either. The morning outside had the brittle light of a new habit. I stepped into it and felt taller, not because I'd done anything brave, but because I had been precise in a building that demanded precision. On the sidewalk, buses yawned, and people began practicing their faces for the day. I breathed in the air that hadn't been filtered in 100 years, and thought absurdly of the instruction about the cup. I would come back the next night and bring 2 again. It wasn't superstition. It was a way to be courteous to an hour. At home, I slept in a way that didn't feel like quitting. When I woke, the city had already put on its noise. My phone had 3 messages I didn't listen to. I made tea because coffee belonged to the building in my mind. By early evening, I found myself looking forward to the elevator's small consideration, the scanner's moods, the mezzanine's brief acknowledgments that felt like finding a neighbor in a big place. The job was simple. The rules were simpler. I wanted the simplicity like you want a clean page. That second night, the ledger wanted me 2 lines down from where I'd signed before. I didn't argue. The guard nodded as if that had been a test I'd passed. Storm later, he said, glancing at the clock. If the radio talks during the storm, let it finish. Weather likes to hear itself. I won't answer, I said, and the words felt like buckling a belt. Answer at the hour, he said. Tell me something boring. Like what? Like the number of boxes, he said, and smiled. It makes the building jealous. The elevator blinked at me in a friendly way. On 3, the corridor smelled of warm dust. I set my things down, greeted the room in my head because sometimes that helps, and began to work. At 10, I told the radio there were 12 boxes on the cart. The mezzanine said, "Heard," and the shelf across from me creaked as if it would have preferred a different number. At 11, I said there were 11. At midnight, 10. I was lying to the building courteously, giving it something to want without giving it anything it could take. At 12:40, the west stair repeated itself twice so neatly that it felt like a drum beat. At 1:05, my reflection asked me a question with its eyes, and I answered by closing mine. At 1:30, the red notebook was back in the folder, with a new line in the neat, tired hand. If you bring 2 cups at 3:15, leave one near the elevator, he prefers the hall. At 3:15, I left the second cup on the small table by the elevator bank, not in the car, because the rule didn't say in. Steam rose, and the brass trim reflected it like weather in miniature. I went back to work. At 3:59, I collected the cup, its surface marked with the faintest ring where a lip had been, though no lip had been there. I washed it without looking for proof. I dried it thoroughly. I put it back on the shelf where cups rest and pretend to be ordinary. At 4:40, the building gently, a big cat turning over in sleep. The radio spoke my name in a voice that sounded like the mezzanine and a room in rain braided. I told it the number of boxes. It went quiet, satisfied with arithmetic. At 5:40, I closed up exactly as before. At the ledger downstairs, my hand hesitated, just once, because the line that wanted me was not the next one, but the one below it, and I realized the book was keeping time with me, not the other way around. I signed where it wanted. The guard's pencil paused over his crossword. "You'll do," he said. 3 nights is knowing, 5 is belonging. If you leave before 5, bring a receipt, even if it burns twice. I nodded as if that were a thing people said. Outside, morning had set the table again, and I went home to sleep, counting my breaths the way a kind building likes, steady and exact, keeping the small rules that let bigger things leave you alone. The third night greeted me like an old habit. The bus ride blurred by in pieces of streetlight, and I stepped onto the Whittemore and glass sidewalk before the hour had fully darkened. The limestone looked softer than it had the first night, as if the building had decided to trust me with more of its weight. The guard on the mezzanine barely glanced up. He seemed to know my footsteps now. His blazer hung on the hook, the same dignified tilt, as if it had always belonged to the wall. "Ledger?" he said, pencil in hand, voice steadier than the night outside. The book waited open on the marble table. The line below my last entry was already thirsty. Paper grain angled toward my pen. I signed where it wanted. The ink darkened in an instant, obedient. The guard's pencil scratched across his crossword, a sound of mild approval. "Storm cleared," he said. "The building will try something quieter tonight. That's when people make mistakes." "Quieter is harder," I admitted. "Always," he said, not unkindly. "Noise tells on itself. Quiet waits for you to tell on yourself." I pocketed the keycard and pressed the elevator's brass button. The car came promptly. No hesitation, no tricks. The placard by the door had begun to shine in my memory without needing to look. West stairs between midnight and 3. 4th floor. Radios at the hour. Reflections not your business. North doors only. Rules as clear as prayers, as sharp as warnings. I repeated them under my breath as the elevator lifted me. On 3, the corridor breathed paper and warm dust. The archive door recognized me with a sigh in its hinges. I set the boxes on the table and greeted the scanner like an old colleague. My reflection in its glass was faint, almost polite, as if it had been taught manners by the guard himself. The radio crackled once, then stilled, saving its first word for the hour. I worked. Work was becoming easier, my hands knowing the scanner's moods, my body remembering when to stand, when to stretch, letters from the late 1940s, typed on onion skin paper that still held the crisp scent of carbon, claims for floods, for broken windows, for the kind of accidents that sound small in retelling but are disasters in the moment. Each page flattened under my palm, scanned into permanence, set back into the box with the respect you give bones. At 10, I pressed the button. Third floor. Working. All well. Mezzanine. Heard. The guard's voice was steady. His words clipped, as though the hour had no room for ornament. The building hummed. I could almost feel the ducks exhaling behind the walls. Somewhere below, a door shifted in its frame, a soft click like punctuation. I fed pages, named files, lined them in their folders. My thoughts thinned until only the work and the clock remained. Tick, scan, save. Tick, scan, save. The rhythm became its own answer. At 10:37, the west stair creaked, once, though no one should have been using it. I paused, my fingers on the paper, listening. The sound came again, fainter, like an echo stretched too far. Protocol 1 echoed in my mind. Do not use between midnight and 3. It tends to repeat itself. It was early yet, but maybe the stairs were rehearsing. I turned back to the scanner, keeping my eyes fixed on the glass. At 11, the radio clicked. Third floor, I said. 2 boxes down. Mezzanine. Heard. Count them again. I counted aloud into the radio. 10 remaining. Good, he said. The building wanted a different number. The line went quiet. My skin prickled. I looked at the boxes, counted them silently. 10. They hadn't moved, but for one instant, I thought I could see their shadows stacked a little differently, taller, as if a hand had touched them when I wasn't watching. I wrote the number in my notebook, a small defense against doubt. At 11:20, footsteps. Not the measured kind I'd heard before, but light, quick, like someone pacing to keep awake. They stopped outside the door. The grill framed nothing but shadow, but I felt watched. A whisper followed, not words, but the shape of breath forming in tension. My throat tightened. The rules repeated in my mind. Radios at the hour, not before. I didn't move. The whisper lengthened, testing the silence, and then withdrew, footsteps fading toward the stairwell. I exhaled only when the building exhaled with me. At 11:55, I stood stretching. The window glass was black with night. My reflection blurred across it. My face pale, my hair pulled back. I avoided my eyes, remembering Protocol 4. But in the glass, my reflection's hand lifted when mine did not. It tapped the sill 3 times like a code. I froze. My real hand remained still at my side. The reflection smiled faintly, then vanished into the black. I stepped back, breath shaking, and turned to the radio, waiting for the hour. At 12, third floor, working, boxes accounted, mezzanine, heard, the guard said, though his voice carried a rasp as if he'd been running. Don't look at the glass tonight. I didn't, I said. That's why you're still answering. His tone made no room for misunderstanding. The storm of the night before had gone, but the quiet was sharper, more insistent. I scanned pages, forcing my eyes to the text, my ears to the radio's silence. Every tick of the clock felt like a test. At 12:40, the elevator chimed softly in the hall. Though I hadn't pressed the button, the doors opened with a sigh. I stayed at my table, pulse quick. The air shifted, like the car had exhaled a breath it had held too long. Then the doors closed, slow and disappointed. I let the silence rebuild itself. At 1:07, the radio, third floor, I said, 7 boxes remaining. Mezzanine, heard. Weather? Clear, I said. Not for long, he answered, and the radio clicked out. At 1:14, the scanner stopped. Its screen flickered, black, then pale green. Lines of text scrolled where the claim form should have been. The words were mine, my own notes, my handwriting digitized, though I had not written them. They read, "Keep receipt if it burns twice. Return coin when the day wants it. Ask it back." The screen went black. My hands trembled as I pulled the page, scanned again, and this time it behaved. I saved the file quickly, as though speed could undo what I had seen. At 1:30, the red notebook appeared again in the wrong folder. Its page had gained another line. "If you hear your name before the hour, say the number of breaths you've taken." Nothing else. I copied the instruction into my notebook and returned the red one to its place, though I knew it would not stay. At 1:55, the radio hissed. My name, spoken slowly, like someone tasting it for the first time. My chest tightened. I counted my breaths, steady, deliberate. 132, I said. The hiss faded. The radio was silent until the hour, when the guard's voice returned, calm and ordinary. "Third floor? Working. 6 boxes left. Heard," he said. His tone carried no hint that anything had happened. At 2:10, the west stair began again, this time louder, heavier, like boots. They reached the landing, paused, then repeated, over and over, as if the stairwell itself had grown bored and decided to loop a memory. I pressed my hands to my knees, holding still. The sound grew louder, closer, until I felt the vibration in the floor. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the sound. I counted the boxes again, just to hear my own voice. At 2:30, the reflection returned, not in the window, but in the scanner glass. My face upside down, staring at me with eyes that didn't blink. I closed the lid gently, covering it. The scanner hummed like a throat clearing, then quieted. I pressed the radio at the hour and forced my voice to be steady. "Third floor, 4 boxes left." "Heard," the guard said. His voice sounded tired, but alive. At 3 p.m., my body ached with weariness. I made coffee in the copy room, poured 2 cups, set one on the table by the elevator, as the red notebook had instructed. Steam curled. I sipped mine and felt the warmth reach my bones. At 3:15, the cup by the elevator had cooled, the surface rippling faintly, as though someone had just set it down. I carried it back, washed it, dried it. No proof remained, but the crack in the glaze was deeper now, almost a second mouth. I put it back and returned to my chair, throat dry. At 3:30, the scanner took a page and gave me an image of a corridor. Not mine, not this building's. Long, dim, lined with doors. At the end, a shadow turned. I deleted it, scanned again. The claim form appeared, ordinary. I saved it quickly and didn't look at the file again. At 4, the radio. "Third floor, 2 boxes left. Heard. Don't answer any knocks," the guard said. "That's not a protocol, that's just advice." At 4:20, 3 soft knocks came at the archive door. Not insistent, courteous. My name whispered. Low. I held my breath. The knocks came again, slower. I pressed the coin in my pocket, though I hadn't meant to bring it. It warmed under my fingers. The silence returned. I exhaled only when the clock ticked louder, reclaiming the room. At 5, the last pages scanned, the files saved. I stacked the boxes neatly, rolled the cart to the cage, and locked it. The padlock clicked shut with satisfaction. At 5:40, I stood before the ledger again. My hand hesitated. The line it wanted was 2 spaces down. I signed there. The ink bloomed like a bruise. The guard watched me from above, pencil idle. 3 nights is knowing, he said. 5 is belonging. You're at knowing now. The next 2 will decide which way it goes. I nodded, though my throat felt thick, and after 5, the building remembers you, he said. It doesn't forget. The doors opened. The morning light poured in, pale and forgiving. I stepped outside, the rules circling in my head, and thought of the notebook's line. Ask it back. I wondered if I had the courage. The 4th night began, before I even reached the doors. I knew it because the air outside Whittemore and Glass felt different, as though the building had unbuttoned part of itself to see if I'd notice. The limestone glowed faintly under streetlight. less a surface than a face waiting for recognition. The guard on the mezzanine raised his eyes when I stepped inside. His pencil hovered over the crossword, but hadn't committed to a word. Ledger, he said, though his tone carried weight tonight, heavier than the first 3 nights. The book waited for me on the marble table, its cover open, pen resting diagonal like a compass needle that already knew my direction. I placed my name 2 lines down from where I thought I should, and the page accepted it without protest. The ink shimmered faintly in the lobby light, as if the paper were rehearsing its own echo. The guard studied me for longer than usual. 4 nights, he said. That's a threshold. If you cross it polite, you might find belonging. If you cross it careless, you'll find something else. What's on the other side? I asked, though my voice cracked. He shook his head, not refusing to answer, but letting me know the question wasn't mine to ask yet. North doors don't forget, he said. And if the radio tells you something about yourself you didn't know, don't argue, just nod. I didn't like that rule. He didn't care if I liked it. The elevator came quickly, its doors opening like an old friend deciding to be kind. On the ride up, I watched my reflection faint in the metal walls, not sharp enough to catch my eyes, but enough to remind me I had them. I pressed 3. The car rose without hesitation. The corridor smelled sharper tonight, less paper, more ozone, like the aftermath of a photocopier running too hot. The archive door greeted me with its usual reluctant sigh. Inside, the boxes stood ready, stacked in the neatness of waiting. The scanner hummed, glass cool under my palm. The radio clicked once, acknowledging me without words, then fell silent until the hour. I began with insurance claims from 1947, thin sheets typed by hands long gone. The words felt brittle in my fingers, brittle in the way memories sometimes are, capable of snapping if handled wrong. I fed them to the scanner, flattened the folds gently, saved each digital echo into its folder. At 10i, I pressed the radio. 3rd floor, working, 10 boxes remaining. The guard's voice came steady. Mezzanine, heard. You sound tired. Drink water. I obeyed, pouring a glass from the jug in the corner. The water tasted faintly metallic, as if the pipes remembered storms. At 10:30, I glanced at the window. It was dark, reflecting me dimly. My reflection seemed normal at first, but when I lifted my hand to rub my neck, it didn't follow. Instead, it wrote something in condensation across the glass, though I hadn't breathed near it. 1 word, ask. My stomach nodded. Protocol 4 whispered, reflections after 2 a.m. are none of our business. But it wasn't 2 yet. Was this the building bending the rules, or was I? I turned away and buried myself in work. At 11, the radio clicked. 3rd floor, 9 boxes left, I said. Mezzanine, heard. Boxes are listening. His words unsettled me. I counted them aloud anyway. 1, 2, 3. The sound of my own voice reassured me, though the shadows near the stack shifted faintly, as if the boxes adjusted themselves when unobserved. At 11:15, the west stare repeated itself, faint but insistent, step after step, then again, like a skipping record. I stayed at my table, hands steady on the scanner. The sound ceased abruptly, replaced by a whisper that pressed through the grill in the door. My name, drawn out like a rope being pulled. I remembered the red notebook's instruction. If you hear your name before the hour, count your breaths. 150, I whispered. The sound faded, leaving only the hum of the lights. At 11:30, the scanner refused a page. Instead of an image, the screen filled with text I hadn't written. The handwriting looked like mine, but older, as if aged by years I hadn't lived yet. The words read, "Don't answer with silence. Silence is still an answer. Ask it back." The letters pulsed faintly on the screen, then vanished. I scanned again. The page appeared normal. I saved it quickly, but my fingers trembled. At 11:55, I prepared for the check-in, nervous. The radio hissed. My name again, softer this time, coaxing. I pressed the button and said firmly, 200 breaths. The hiss stopped. At the hour, the guard's voice arrived, steady but weary. 3rd floor, 8 boxes left. Heard, he said, then paused. Don't let it charm you. Charm is a hunger with good posture. Midnight settled differently tonight. The silence had edges. I scanned page after page, forcing rhythm into my bones. The tick of the clock became a lifeline. At 12:20, the elevator chimed in the hall. The doors opened. I didn't press the button. The car waited, empty, its light too bright for the corridor. I ignored it, pressing the radio instead. 3rd floor, elevator opened. Mezzanine. Heard. Let it close itself. It did, reluctantly, as if disappointed in me. At 12:40, the window reflection returned. This time it didn't mimic me at all. It simply stared, its eyes darker than mine, its mouth set in a question I couldn't hear. I turned my chair so the window was behind me. The reflection could have all the staring it wanted. At 1, the radio. 3rd floor, 6 boxes remaining. Heard, the guard said. His voice wavered, as if the building had leaned too close to his perch. At 1:15, the scanner displayed not text but a photograph, black and white, grainy, of the very room I sat in, but emptier, with wooden tables instead of steel. In the center of the image, a woman sat at a desk. Her face was pale, hair tied back, eyes fixed on something outside the frame. Her hands rested on a red notebook. I blinked. The image vanished. The page scanned normally. I saved it, my pulse hammering. At 1:30, I checked the box labeled Night Ledger Borrowed. The red notebook was inside. I opened it carefully. A new line had appeared. At 1:45, open the ledger downstairs. It will already be open for you. Sign nothing, only look. My throat tightened. I shouldn't. Protocol said nothing about leaving my floor. Yet the note pulsed in my mind like a heartbeat. At 1:40, I hesitated at the archive door, radio in hand. The corridor stretched long, lights buzzing. I pressed the button, 3rd floor, leaving to check something. Silence. Then the guard's voice. You'll find it open. Don't linger. My legs carried me to the elevator. The ride down was long, as though the building had stretched itself. The lobby was dim, shadows deeper than before. The big ledger lay open on the marble table, pages spread wide. I approached slowly. Names filled the lines, neat and endless, in handwriting that shifted from decade to decade. Some names I recognized faintly, old city officials, businessmen whose portraits I'd seen in dusty hallways. And then I saw mine, written not once but twice. The first entry was from the first night. The second was from tonight. Below it, a third space waited, my name already half formed in faint gray, as though the book had started writing it for me. I stepped back quickly, breath sharp. The ink shimmered faintly in the dim light. I whispered without meaning to, "What do you keep when we don't answer?" The ledger pages rustled as if caught in wind, though the air was still. I turned and hurried back to the elevator, heart pounding. At 1:55, I returned to the archive, chest tight. The radio hissed my name again. I whispered, 280 breaths, and it stopped. At the hour, the guard's voice came calm. 3rd floor? 5 boxes left. Heard. You looked. Good. Looking is safer than signing. At 2:15, the west stair boomed louder, heavier, until the sound vibrated the walls. It repeated the landing 3 times before fading. The silence after was a vacuum. At 2:30, my reflection in the scanner glass smiled faintly, though my lips were pressed tight. It lifted its hand and pointed downward, toward the lobby. I shut the lid quickly, breath shallow. At 2:40, the scanner spit out another image, the ledger, open, with my name written a 3rd time. I hadn't touched it. The ink was fresh. My stomach dropped. I saved the file under the name the machine insisted on, my name 11948. At 3 wall, 3rd floor, 3 boxes left. Heard, the guard said, his voice sharp. Finish tonight. Tomorrow belongs to it. At 3:15, I poured 2 cups of coffee, leaving one by the elevator as before. When I returned at 3:59, the cup was empty, dry, as if nothing had ever filled it. I washed it, dried it, put it back. At 4, the radio hissed once, then spoke. My name, followed by words I hadn't expected. You belong here now. My chest clenched. Protocol said, do not argue. So I nodded, though the guard couldn't see. At 4:10, the scanner gave me one last trick, a file image of my own hand holding the brass coin from the coastal town, though I had left it at home. I stared, shaken, then saved it under the date the system assigned, 5:40. At 5:00, I finished the last pages, locked the boxes in the cage. My hands shook as I pressed the elevator button. The ride down was smooth, the car patient. The ledger waited again on the marble table. My name now appeared 3 times, each darker than the last. The pen lay diagonally, daring me. I didn't touch it. The guard's eyes followed me from the mezzanine, pencil still. 4 nights, he said softly. You've crossed. Tomorrow decides if you keep your house, or if the building keeps it for you. I nodded, throat too tight to speak. I left by the north doors into the brittle light of morning. The city had begun to stir, buses yawning, people practicing faces for the day. But my thoughts remained behind, in the lobby, with the ledger that wrote my name before I did. The 5th night met me at the curb like a verdict. The limestone looked almost wet under the streetlights, as if the building had washed its face before seeing me. My feet knew the rhythm up the steps. Inside, the lobby held its breath politely. The guard on the mezzanine didn't speak for a moment, pencil hovering, blazer a dark shoulder against the rail. Then ledger. He didn't need to say more. The book lay open on the marble table, with the pen resting at a precise diagonal that felt like a hand placed on a forearm. Easy now. I looked without letting my eyes rest anywhere too long. My name occupied 3 lines already, the 3rd one darker than ink has any business being. Below it, the page had swollen very slightly, as though something beneath the paper were inhaling. A 4th space waited. The first letter of my name ghosted there like frost on glass. I didn't touch the pen. North doors when you go, the guard said in his usual tone, and then almost gently, if it calls you by a name you like better than your own, pretend you didn't hear. It felt like a benediction disguised as bureaucracy. I pressed the elevator button. The car came without coyness. On the ride up, my reflection in the brushed metal watched me not watch it, and we were both satisfied with the manners of the arrangement. The corridor on 3 smelled like warm paper and the inside of a coat you trust. The archive door sighed me in. Boxes, 6 neat spines of work. The scanner quiet, glass cool as a truth. The clock on the wall held its second hand like a baton, insisting each beat be counted and none be dramatized. The radio clicked once, a courteous throat clear for the hour to come, and slept again. I began. Sometimes work is the rope you throw yourself. Forms from 46-47, a hailstorm's tally, a recovered safe, a basement flood that read like a confession. Flatten, feed, smooth, scan, name, save. 10 minutes in, my body remembered the order and took it from my worried mind. At 10, I pressed the radio. 3rd floor, working. 6 boxes remaining. Mezzanine, came steady, heard. Drink water, keep your count. I obeyed. The pipes tasted like they had learned civility from storms. At 10:22, the west stair gave a single small creak, as if clearing its throat to make sure I was still listening. I didn't move. At 10:37, the elevator chimed and opened in the hall. The car's light fell a little too far into the corridor. I didn't look. It waited, then closed, disappointed in a way I could feel in my teeth. At 11 check-in, 4 boxes left. Heard, the mezzanine said, and then quieter. If the glass asks, don't answer. If it writes, read with your eyes closed. I didn't ask him how. Moments later, the window found frost, where there should have been only black. Letters drew themselves faintly in the dim. Keep count. The words unwrote themselves at once, shy to be caught behaving. I turned my chair so the window became a wall, and the wall became everything that mattered. Paper, light. My own breath counted to 10, and then again. At 11:18, the scanner flashed an image not from any claim. The ledger downstairs, open, my name written a fourth time, and beneath it a single line that did not belong to signatures at all. House kept. I blinked it away, scanned again, received the ordinary gray rectangular solace of typewritten damage. I saved the file under its assigned name and didn't try to rename it. At 11:43, footsteps, not the measured kind, but a single pair learning how to be careful. They stopped outside the grill. A voice like paper held to the mouth said my name exactly the way my grandmother would when she found me awake at a forbidden hour. My throat warmed with the memory. I pressed my tongue to the roof of my mouth and counted breaths. When I reached 100, the voice became the hall again, and the hall became quiet. At 12 third floor, I said. 3 boxes left. Heard, the mezzanine replied. A pause. It'll make you an offer after 2. Offers are not questions. Keep your rule. I wanted to ask what my rule was, and then remembered I'd been practicing it all week. Answer only at the hour, count your own house, ask it back. I worked. The building was listening. I could feel it in the way the duck's hum shifted. A not quite melody changing its key to lean closer. At 12:27, the west stair began its repetition, landing and landing, like a needle stuck in one groove of a record that refuses to be a song. It went on long enough to force me into choosing. I chose to stand, place both feet flat, and say softly into the room that did not require my voice, "We are not walking." The stair, as if embarrassed, stopped. At 12:40, the scanner produced a photograph of the lobby in the 1930s, marble brighter, palms and brass planters. A man with a newspaper under his arm paused halfway to the south doors. On the table, the ledger stood thinner, younger, its paper less thirsty. In the mezzanine, a guard leaned just as mine leans, his blazer a century's cousin. I let the image pass through me, the way you let a story do its work. Scan, save. A name for the file arrived uninvited. When you leave, turn left. I kept the assigned numeric. The building could keep its prose. At 1 juror, 3rd floor, 2 boxes. Heard, the mezzanine said, a breath later adding, reflections are none of our business. The glass of the scanner hummed in agreement, as if flattered to be excluded. At 1:11, the red notebook waited in the wrong folder again. I opened it because pretending I wouldn't would have been another kind of invitation. A single line, neat and tired. At 1:30, go to the lobby. Look at the ledger. Ask it back. Sign nothing that speaks first. My hand itched. The rule I'd learned in the coastal town. Ask it back. Rose like a life jacket in water. I pressed the radio. 3rd floor. Going to lobby at 1:30. Silence stretched. Then the guard. Go. Do not touch the pen unless the book asks you a question, and waits. If it tells you anything, nod and come back. The elevator carried me a little slower, as if savoring me. The lobby had been polished by night. The ledger lay open like a chest cavity, learning how to breathe again. Lines and lines of names. The air above the paper had a weight. When I stepped within arm's length, the ink in my 3 signatures deepened, as though made wet again by attention. A 4th space waited. Ghost letter faint. I felt it lean. The rules I'd written on the inside of my throat put my voice in order. What do you owe us? The pages did not riffle. The building did not groan. The air grew dense with the feeling of someone halfway through deciding. A faint smell like old receipts warmed beside the book. The pen rolled a fraction, then stilled, pointed toward the line beneath my name. My mouth began to shape the first letter, and my own rule knocked my teeth together. Ask it back. What do you keep when we do not answer? The pen rolled back as if someone had put a finger on it. The half letter on the page unghosted itself and then thinned again, indecisive. A word formed faintly in the gutter of the ledger, not in ink, but in dented paper, as if written with a dry nib. Return. I thought of the cup at 3:15, the way steam had shaped and gone. I thought of the careful ring on the glaze, the crack deepening. I thought of the way the guard had said bring a receipt, even if it burns twice. I set my right hand on the edge of the table, palms clean, and nodded to the book with the respect due a living thing. Then I stepped back and returned to the elevator without putting any mark to paper. The car's floor rose under me like a breath. Back on 3, the archive glowed with the same patient light. My chair had kept my shape. At 1:55, the radio spoke my name in the voice of a person I trusted from a decade ago. I counted breaths, steady, 212. It sighed and withdrew. At 212, it sighed and withdrew. At 2 sarin 4, 1 box. Heard, the mezzanine replied, voice thin with endurance. It's going to tell you the terms. Let them pass through. Keep your house. The terms arrived in the way old instruments announce themselves, a hum in the duct that turned into vowels before it turned into words. The room cooled just enough to make my forearms sing. It said no. It urged without calendar or clock. We keep the names that you write and the hours you let us. We give you passage, and we give you quiet, and we give you a place to set your work down. Tell us yes with your hand, and your time will live here. Tell us no with your silence, and we will return your time to you in small coins. You will lose between couch cushions. I felt the pen downstairs without touching it. I felt the ledger's page poised like a breath. The radio stayed wisely asleep. The clock gave me its count. I thought of the guard guarding a different kind of mathematics. I thought of the coastal bell asking, "What will you give me?" And the only answer that had worked, "What do you give me?" I bent over the last pages and did the plainest work of the week. Flatten, feed, scan, save. The scanner took the final sheet with a small gratitude. Done. The cartwheels did not squeak when I pushed it. The padlock clicked shut as if enjoying the sound of closure. The elevator waited and did not try to be clever. At 5, the radio woke precisely to say nothing at all, a static the shape of a nod. At 5:12, footsteps in the hall kept perfect pace with my cart and stopped when I stopped. I didn't test it. At 5:20, the west stair rested, finally bored with itself. At 5:30, my reflection in the window remembered to be only mine. At 5:39, I stood in the lobby again with the ledger in its posture of appetite. The pen lay exactly where I had left it, which is to say, exactly where it had wanted to be. The half letter beneath my name was paler still, like a bruise resolving. I breathed, counted 5 of the slowest breaths I owned, and let the book hear my rule again without words. You owe me my house. The paper made no sound. The air softened as if starch had been rinsed from it. On the mezzanine, the guard's pencil stopped moving and then moved again, just enough to tell me he had witnessed what didn't happen. I took the pen, not to the page the ledger wanted, but to the margin outside the ruled lines, and drew a small circle with a line through it, a private sign that meant not now, not like this, closed for night. The nib scratched lightly. The mark looked foolish and precisely right. I set the pen down. The book accepted my impertinence, the way an ocean accepts a pebble, entirely and without conceding anything. North doors, the guard reminded, voice normal again, human-sized. I looked up at him. He looked back, a man at a rail in an old building, tired and careful and alive. 5 nights, he said. That's belonging. You kept your house. Does it forgive me? I asked, not sure whether I meant the building, or the book, or the part of me that had wanted to sign. He considered that as if it were a good crossword clue. It remembers you, he said. It lets you go through the mornings. That's what forgiveness is, in places like this. The north doors opened into a thin dawn that had polished its light on the river. I stepped out with the rules in my pockets, like receipts that would not burn. Buses yawned. A woman walking a dog nodded as if she knew where I'd been. The city's louder clocks started their day. I let them be theirs. At home, I set water to boil, and without thinking, reached for 2 mugs. I poured into one and left the other empty, then laughed at myself and filled them both. When I slept, I dreamed not of ledgers or stairs or glass, but of pages lying flat under a palm, of a pen rolling toward a hand and stopping, of a radio making the sound a person makes when they're about to say your name and decide to let you keep it. The next week, I returned to Whittemore and Glass because contracts end when they end, and doors remember you politely for a while. The elevator blinked agreement. The mezzanine guard wore his blazer like weather. The ledger wanted me where it wanted me, and I replied by placing my hand on the marble an inch away, the way you greet a dog that isn't yours. The book seemed satisfied with the courtesy. I worked. I kept the hour. When the building asked me again in its various voices to move my house into its pages, I asked it back and then asked it smaller questions. How many boxes tonight? How many steps on the stair? How many breaths until the hour says we're allowed to speak? Places like to be counted. Counting makes shapes. Shapes keep you. On my last shift before the contract finished, I slipped the red notebook into the proper folder because it had learned to leave itself in the wrong places when it wanted company. There was one new line in the neat, tired hand. If you leave before 5 nights, bring a receipt. If you leave after, bring a rule. I wrote beneath it, small as a seamstress's mark. I keep my house. Ask me back. I closed the cover, washed a cup that had not been used, dried it, left no proof of wet. The ledger downstairs lay open as always. I nodded to it, as you nod to an instrument that is played well and cleanly. The guard lifted his pencil and set it down and said nothing because nothing needed saying. The north doors gave me the day, and the day took me, and the building behind me ticked in its bones, a metronome that would continue with or without my attention. In the weeks that followed, when the city grew loud, and I felt myself thinning to the shape of a person only bus windows recognize, I took out the habit I had brought home from Whitmore and Glass and counted the kettle's small argument, the elevator in my apartment deciding, the neighbor's careful key, the click my door makes when it forgives me for leaving again. If a pane of night glass ever thought to write me a word, I let it keep its vocabulary. If a stare repeated itself in the corner of my mind, I did not correct it. If a ledger waited in my sleep with a pen tilted at a persuasive angle, I placed my palm on the table beside it and asked it back, "What do you owe me?" And when morning came, as it does, as it did, I left by the north doors of whatever room I was in, belonging to myself and to the small rules that buy the kind of quiet a person can actually rest inside. Thank you for listening. If this story kept you company tonight, consider liking the video and subscribing for more myths, legends, and gentle hauntings. Sleep well, and may the trails you choose lead you safely home.